Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the One Vote conference. My name is Maansi Verma. I am with the Article 21 Trust. I am the curator of this conference, and Article 21 Trust works on issues at the intersection of technology and welfare. In the past, we have worked on issues with respect to Aadhaar, personal data protection, non-personal data, use of technology in justice dispensation. And this conference is an extension of our work in that direction. Also very timely and relevant given the fact that we are in the middle of election season right now. And very recently in the winter session of Parliament, we also saw the passage of a bill to link Aadhaar with voter ID, one of the issues that we will be discussing in this conference today. The One Vote conference has been organized to bring together people, citizens, legal experts, technologists, activists who are interested in exploring the issues related to technology, democracy, election, and our right to vote. Throughout the conference, we will be dealing with a wide range of issues related to how voters' data is appropriated with the use of money, data, and electoral bonds in election, how digital campaigning is rewriting the rule of election campaigning, and how intrusive state technologies with respect to surveillance have the power to upend democracy. These are some of the many other issues which we are going to be discussing in this conference today. At this stage, I would also like to introduce to you all Padmini Ray Murray, who has very kindly agreed to be the MC for the conference today. Padmini, I welcome you to the conference. Padmini has been very closely working on issues with respect to technology. Her work specifically has looked at issues with respect to challenging acts of infrastructural and algorithmic violence, and creating alternative digital spaces and imaginations that are characterized by feminist values, specifically on ethics of care. She is also the founder of Design Beku, a collective that works with technologists, grassroots organizations, and researchers to create such spaces. So, Padmini, I would like to invite you to take the conversation ahead from here. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much for that welcome, Maansi. So just to give you some ground rules for how the conference is going to run. The event is organized in a meeting format, so please do keep your cameras and your audios turned off while the talks are going on. Please note that this is being live streamed on the Quint YouTube channel, and you can also leave questions there. There will be a breakout room session, which will be moderated by Riya Singh Soni and Pravita Kashyap of Rethink Aadhaar, to discuss how one can resist the linking of Aadhaar and voter ID. This will start at 1700 at 5 p.m. and run simultaneously with the main conference. With regards to questions, you are free to add your questions in the chat while the talk is going on. Also, after the talks are finished, you can raise your hand and ask questions, and I will be queuing and collating the questions. Or you can also alternatively type your questions in the chat window, and I will pick questions from there. Needless to say, we might not have the time to address all the questions in each chat session, but if you leave your questions here, hopefully they will be addressed later in the session or directed to the speakers themselves. And the videos, so this conference is being recorded and videos will be made available after the conference on the HasGeek and Article 21 websites. We're just waiting for Usha Ramanathan to join us.
I'm here,
the first speaker. You're here? Brilliant.
Yeah.
Great. So it is a great pleasure to welcome Usha Ramanathan, who is well known as an activist and a scholar of law. She has been tracking and engaging with the UID project and has written and debated extensively on the subject. So today she'll be talking about data and databases and how they can be considered, quote, a community resource. The job of the Election Commission is not just to conduct periodic elections, but to also keep it free and fair. If the secret ballot is no longer secret, and if people feel that it is not secret or safe, it is no longer free or fair. Importantly, when these institutions of state allow themselves to be hijacked for purposes other than that, for what they have been set up, such as the RGI did with the census and the NPR, then they are not just going way beyond the statute that set them up, but they are morphing into something else. A 2012 policy on data sharing says that the data about people that any department holds becomes its property, quote unquote. This is an appropriation of that which is not theirs. And this is where the ECI is headed. And Usha will be speaking about this today. Thank you so much, Usha.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. So I'll just launch into it straight off. See this voter ID UID link, which is being proposed now, like we all know, is not anything new. The idea has been forever that this will be, everything will be linked with everything, and the UID number will be should be found everywhere in every database. This was the original plan. This was the conception. So we should not be surprised that it's happening now. It's just that it's not a good idea. What is more recent is an admission, if I can call it that, by Mr. Maansi Verma and AP Singh on behalf of the UIDAI when it was started, speaking as founding members of the UIDAI. They have said and it's on YouTube now, they have categorically stated that this UIDAI and the database that is created was not created by them thinking that it would be of use to the government, but that it would be used to create a digital economy. That is, it's there in the Aadhaar 2.0 proceedings. It's on the session that they had on digital, what's it? Commerce, digital, what do we call ourselves? A digital economy. So it's in that session. So it's kind of open now, and there is no doubt at all about why this was created. This is very useful to know because it also tells us why exclusion, which has been caused by the UIDAI and by the way that database works, why exclusion has not been a problem. And that, to create a business infrastructure. And, in 2018, when the case was being argued in court, Mr. Nilakani wrote an article in the paper where he said, listen, this is really not just an ID. It's creating infrastructure. It's like creating a road. Anybody can use that road. And that's the purpose of this whole exercise, because it will boost the economy. So I think one of the, from the time that we started, that the project started, where they were saying that this has to do with delivering services, that the poor need an ID, that the poor need to do whatever it is that, they need to do whatever they can to be able to identify themselves to the state. And that is the purpose for which this whole project was started. From there to the admission now that it was never intended for the state. In fact, they use very interesting language where they say that the state is now is holding this captive, that they've usurped this system which was never meant for them. And they are advising, Mr. Maansi Verma and AP Singh are advising the UIDAI that it's time for them to stop being a regulator and for them to take it back and give it back to the digital economy. So that's something that I'm stressing on, because I think we need to be very clear that they are not, if we listen, we can hear what's being said, and that will help advance our understanding too. The second thing is just a brief on what is this database with which the voter ID Election Commission wants to link itself. What kind of a database is this? So we know that it is a database that was started. I think Debashish Basu says it very well in his piece for the Business Standard, which is titled Torture Under Transparent Taxation, because now you have income tax proving to be a huge problem. because the way in which that income tax system has been, digital system has been rolled out is proving to be a huge disaster. So while he is angsting about it, he writes, a thorough testing before the launch and continuous debugging through feedback after the launch are the cornerstones of any software development. Amazingly, a tech-savvy government which has Digital India as one of its missions didn't do this adequately. Remember, Aadhaar and goods and services tax were launched with the same attitude. No need to test or bother about feedback. So this is what that whole project is characterized by. That you launch it, you see how it goes, you see what works. There is a whole population that's waiting there to become experimental guinea pigs. And these are now known positions, so there is very little to debate on. What is interesting about this, though, is that one of the persons who's been pushing for this is Mr. Qureshi, who's actually quite a liberal kind of person with whom one can hold a conversation. But on the UID, he seems to think that that's fine. In fact, in one of the interviews, he says, Nandan Nilekani came to my office and told me when I was there that it's a good idea. And we decided that we will link these two. We have seen that throughout this project, it is marketing of this idea rather than actually figuring out what is happening, what this project is about. That's what it's been characterized by. It's just marketing. So we find, I was actually intrigued when on 9th November, the year before last, when Mr. Maansi Verma's book came out, they had a discussion on it. And at the discussion in 2020, from October 31st, there was a expose. I mean, they done, one of the Abhishek had done an investigative piece, and then it carried on. I mean, from October 31st till well into December, almost every day there would be an article about how minority scholarships had got siphoned off and how the UID was used for this siphoning off. And it just required 3 people, the principal of a school, a business correspondent kind of person, and one other, the person who's operating the machine, for them to be able to get together and siphon off a whole load of monies that were meant for minority scholarships. And so this started on October 31st, and on 9th November of 2020, you have this discussion on Mr. Maansi Verma's book, and there are 4 bureaucrats who are sitting there and having this discussion, and they seem completely oblivious that there is any problem at all, that UID has not, that it has produced any problem, that people are having difficulties with it, that corruption is actually being fostered through this, and that it's very important that the Indian Express expose, they did not expose it as something that was happening in the government. They got information from activists in the field that this is happening, and they did an investigation themselves. The system hasn't responded to this at all. So now they've referred it in 2020, they referred it to the CBI, they referred it to a whole host of people. Nothing has happened. 2 days ago, we found that there was in Delhi High Court, it's a case that was registered with the court in 2020 January. And in 2022 January, the court is telling them, because there were some 400 and odd people who accordingly, the charge is that a district magistrate had taken all these, who is himself from Rajasthan, had taken in all these people from Rajasthan and enrolled them as having Delhi addresses, so that they could apply for a job in the DTC. And somebody filed saying that, listen, it needed domicile, these people don't belong here, but it was a fraud that was committed. So there's a case that he wrote to the Delhi government. The Delhi government filed a case, and it hasn't proceeded because the UIDAI refuses to cooperate. So we're reading things like this every day. And it amazes me that you have whole bureaucracies which say, we have no idea about any of this. This is technology. This is fine. There is no problem. If there are problems here and there, we'll kind of sort it out. We'll figure out what we'll do. But we are not going to acknowledge the kind of problem that exists. This is the project, and this is the bureaucratic response to the project. We also recently saw, meaning like yesterday, Money Life had out an article where they said that they'd written about an RTA that they'd filed, where they said that 8 crore updates every year is what the UIDAI says they manage. So it's 7 to 8 crores. They don't give you the breakup. They say we don't know what the various breakups are. It could be for address, it could be for name, it could be for mobile phone, it could be for whatever, for biometrics. But there are 8 crore updates that happen all the time. So this is what, which essentially means, and I'll just move from there to this thing called the tag-up report, which I'm sure many of you have seen, where the tag-up report was given in 2011 January, and Mr. Nilekani was its chair. And they had said, it was about all these revenue systems and how the revenue systems have to be, what's the best way to deal with them, because you have to introduce technology. So tag-up stood for Technology Advisory Group on Unique Projects. And in that, in the sixth chapter in the report, they have a thing called, they talk about what they call a self-cleaning mechanism. And I'm just going to read 2-3 lines from that for you. As the saying goes, this is about data quality. As the saying goes, garbage in, garbage out. An IT system is only as good as the data it consumes. The system design should have a self-cleaning mechanism. For instance, for example, the UIDAI proposes to authenticate the identity of a resident based on data they have provided during enrollment. The system is self-cleaning, and please listen to this a little carefully. The system is self-cleaning because it is in the resident's interest to ensure that the system has correct data, in absence of which he cannot authenticate his own identity. So what they will, it is through incentives, and it goes on further. Clean data can be ensured by standardization of processes, matching and verifying information in workflows, simple and well-defined open platforms, blah, blah, and penalization for non-compliance. It is through incentives that data quality can be managed rather than micromanagement of stakeholders. So it's a fascinating thing where they say if people need to be able to use, use their identity as reflected in the ID system, it is up to them to clean up their own data on the system. And this links up with why people have to keep going again and again and again to the UIDAI to clean up their data. This is a self-cleaning. And this is what the Election Commission wants to depend upon. We know that the process by which the UIDAI created its database and the process by which the Election Commission, constantly works at keeping a good database are completely different. And that the Election Commission takes on a responsibility and a role in the creation and and upgradation of that database constantly, because that is its job. Its job is to make sure that people do have the right to vote, and that people should not be obstructed because they are told that you don't have an ID. That's also the reason why the Election Commission does not confine itself to only one ID being a relevant ID and as something that you can use. It's not just the voter ID. There are a series of IDs which are government-given IDs, which they say can also be used as an ID for them for people to go and vote. Now, by linking it up with the UID, they make the UID the basis for even the election ID, for the voter ID. So the absurdity of it kind of beats me. I can't understand why somebody who's worked so hard to create a proper electoral role will end up, will say that, okay, we'll link it up and we will depend on a database that has been created without any process. You just have enrollers who can sit anywhere. You have common service centers, which sometimes shut down, sometimes because they're all commercial spaces. And we have seen through the years, starting, I think from maybe one of the early ones which hit the headlines was, what do you call it, Dania getting a voter ID, not a voter, sorry, getting enrolled on the UID. Then you had a person in Hyderabad who's supposed to have enrolled over 800 people as biometric exceptions, except that he couldn't have done it because he had already been thrown out of his job, so somebody else was using it. You have the Kanpur fraud, where you found that they could also, they could put things in, they could take things out, they could create IDs. You have the Rachna Khera investigative report that was done. It goes on. It's like endless. And none of these get acknowledged. Finally, we have, however, this Indian Express report has finally found its acknowledgement in a government document. And I think we need to know, we need to see what it is that they are saying. This is the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, which very recently, about a year and some ago, they have, about a year ago, they've said, they're talking about, the minority scholarship scheme and how that got hijacked. And they say 3 central sector scholarship schemes, namely pre-metric, post-metric, and merit-cum means, are being implemented by the Ministry of Minority Affairs for 6 centrally notified minority communities. The committee are quite disturbed by cases reported about the alleged misappropriation of funds going to fake students under these scholarship schemes for children belonging to underprivileged minorities in 6 states, which are under investigation inquiry. In one state, after inquiry, the fraud is stated to have happened due to passwords leaked by certain vested interests as well as other loopholes. Taking advantage of illiteracy, lack of awareness among parents and children of minorities is also exploited by such elements. While the ministry representatives have always been claiming that the system is fail-safe due to all transactions verifications done online, a dedicated portal, cash transfer through DBT and similar measures, which are definitely the need of the hour, it is disconcerting for the committee to observe that such instances of corruption happen. However minuscule, this must have deprived the genuine beneficiaries of government scholarship schemes and may lead to some children dropping out to being unable to afford the school fees, other expenses. During this evidence, the ministry representatives informed the committee about further safety measures. This is last year, okay? So this is 11 years after the project started. The ministry representatives informed the committee about further safety measures under their consideration. For instance, preserving the files of scholarship holder students for a period of 5 years, creation of an Aadhaar vault in coordination with MeitY, requirement of signatures of school principals in verification report filed by teacher, at least 2% physical verification, creation of student data bank with the help of department. So the number of things that they have to do to remedy the problem that has been created by the UID is quite stunning. And we find that, there is this report I found was fascinating also because there is nothing that they've received from the government. There is no investigation report. There's nothing reflected in this report. So what you find is that they are looking at, they are looking at newspaper reports and say, it seems this has happened and it seems that has happened. Absolutely no input from the government, except saying, oh, we'll open Aadhaar vaults after this. So, Election Commission, I think, needs to understand what kind of a system it is that they are dealing with. Now, let's just look at two other reports quickly. You find that Mr. Rijiju had said that actually some standing committees had already okayed the linking of UID with voter ID. So why are people complaining now? Now, when you go and look at what is this place where they are supposed to have said okay, you find that this is report number 101 and report number 105 in 2020, in March and September 2020, on the demand for grants. Now, in the 101 report, they are talking about the Election Commission having launched that 2015 purification authentication program to weed out bogus voters by using unique ID Aadhaar number, which had to be suspended because of the Puttaswamy case. And then they go on to say the commission has approached the Law Ministry for appropriate legislative backup for which amendment to the Representation of the People Act 1950 and the Aadhaar Act 2016 is necessary. By this process, there would be this is significant too. By this process, there would be an intrusion to the privacy of the individual. But the objective of purifying electoral roll will serve the public interest. That's it. No other explanation offered for why privacy should be given a go by. And it's important, I think, here to just pause for a minute and see that privacy means different things in different places. The most significant thing in terms of privacy, I mean, at this point, I would think are two. One element or three. One element of privacy is that you should be able to reflect yourself as you are. And if that gets taken away, that is also a violation of privacy. So if I'm not able to say, if I come to you and say I'm Usha and you say, no, you're not Usha at all, that's actually a violation of my privacy if I can't establish who I am. The other thing is that this is about the secret ballot. I would have thought that, in all this consideration that they say free and fair election, that it should be a secret ballot should be one of the most significant things. And the moment you link this up with the UID, and at this point, I'll just read the last line of this and move on to that. It says here, it was therefore pleaded that the purported invasion of privacy may be permitted for linking voter ID card with Aadhaar number. Now, these are not permissions that a government can give. These are constitutional protections. So here you have a threat to the secret ballot. And the third thing is that it's not, the moment the voter ID is going to tell the UIDAI that this is the person who we are looking to authenticate, UIDAI then has that information. And that number, the person, that number holder will find, because you have no choice today, they have to put their number in various databases. All of us know what is being done with us. So they have to be in multiple databases, and linking these, this idea of convergence. Rahul Mathan, who otherwise supports the project, the only thing he concedes, and this was also the first trilegal report, was where he said that convergence of data can happen, and that's something that should be watched against. Mr. AP Singh, when he came to the Delhi School of Social Work, and when we had a discussion on this, at that time, he said, the rest I'm not sure about, but convergence, it is true, will definitely happen. So we are talking about punishing people if they are not going to be voting the way you want it to be, knowing about people in the first instance, huge possibility of manipulation, because you know so much, the government knows so much about all of these people. One question that could be asked is, why do you say that the government would know? The government knows nothing. This is the UIDAI, and that is an independent agency. But when we look at the Aadhaar Act of 2016, we find that the government controls the UIDAI. The government under that law has the power to give directives to the UIDAI. And if the UIDAI does not follow its directives, it can take it over for 6 months at a time. So we are really talking about an extraordinary kind of thing in that law. And the relationship, so for the Election Commission to say that they will bank on something that is entirely controlled by the central government is a very strange position in which we find ourselves. I think it's also useful to look at other provisions of the Aadhaar Act. I'll mention only one more, which is Section 5. Now, if you look at Section 5, sorry, I'll just go down to Section 5. If you look at Section 5, it says special measures for issuance of Aadhaar number to certain category of persons. The authority shall take special measures to issue Aadhaar numbers to women, children, senior citizens, persons with disability, unskilled and unorganized workers, nomadic tribes, or to such other persons who do not have any permanent dwelling house, and such other categories of individuals as may be specified by regulations. This provision was an indication of all those who the UIDAI recognized even then are likely to have difficulty in getting enrolled. And then you have a problem. In 2019, they had to say, okay, if your biometrics don't work, if you're not able to authenticate yourself, then locally they should deal with it. This is a system that has admitted that it doesn't know what is happening. I'll refer to only one more document, and then we can, we can come back to it later. And okay, now I'm forgetting what the document was I wanted to refer to. It came to my head and moved out immediately. But so let me move to the last thing that I want to say, which is that the UIDAI, and this again is said by Mr. AP Singh at that Aadhaar 2.0 meeting, where he says that there was magic that was created by the project, and that magic lay in 3 numbers. And those 3 were Jandan, Aadhaar, and mobile. He said these 3 linked together can produce magic. And he says, we have already created the system which houses the magic. Now it's for the UIDAI to make sure that that this magic is actually realized, which is basically to say that these three numbers put together will identify people in various ways, which will allow for various businesses to be built on the personal data that can be acquired through these three numbers. The the election voter ID does not require all this kind of information. Voter ID requires that it's only about identity and saying where you can vote. That's it. So there are two things that they say. That one is deduplication, and the other is about migrants being able to work. Now, on deduplication, there is no evidence that they give you at all to say what is the extent of duplicates that they have noticed, what is the difficulty that they have in the other systems that they have in place for them to be able to deal with deduplication. I mean, if there are duplicates, isn't the system that they are doing also producing some kind of result? Is there no other way by which you can do it? Because in the violation of a fundamental right, one of the principles of proportionality is that you do not violate it. For instance, the right to privacy, you will not violate it. You won't violate it unless you simply have to, and it will be to the minimum that you need to. Here, they haven't even said what the extent of the problem is. And if they don't know the extent of the problem, then they have actually no right at all, no constitutional right to use this. The second thing is when they talk about migrants. So actually, there is no evidence on deduplication. And I think we really, really need to demand some kind of information on this, because the same thing happened with PAN cards. They just said, and that was it. There was no need for them to establish anything more. On migrants, they say that, of course, Mr. Nilekani in a recent interview on his new book has said, oh, the migrant, they go to the cities and then they're not able to vote there. They just have to go there and change their address and then they'll be able to go and vote, where they are staying there. So it's a very glib way of treating this. And of course, the easiest thing according to them is that you can change the address at any time. So I'm not sure what kind of a protection that provides to ensure that you're a voter. Maybe, I'll be a voter somewhere 1 month, somewhere else the next month, depending on where the elections are. So it's a very strange and skewed way of looking at this. But apart from that, if they decide that they are going to use biometrics as part of their authentication mechanism, then two things to remember. One, in 2019, when they started talking about one nation, one ration, letters were sent around, which was circulated. I have a copy of the Tripura letter, where they say that there are a series of people. So they say, people above 60, people below 15, people who are disabled, people who can't move, various kinds of, if there is only a one-member family, then you find that, they may not be able to authenticate themselves with the fingerprint. So they can actually establish, they can nominate a person who will then give their biometrics on behalf of the person themselves. This is another very strange kind of thing where my identity will be determined on the basis of somebody else's biometric. Now, this ought not to surprise us, because when questions started getting asked and the UIDAI found itself in a tight corner in 2014-15 up to 2015-16, from the time of the August 11th order till the law got passed, they said that they were setting up something called the UBCC, which is UIDAI Biometric Center of Competence. And the logic for that was that the nature and diversity of India's working population makes biometrics a challenge. And then we thought, okay, maybe they set something up, maybe they got some kind of, maybe some report, something. We actually found when we ferreted that not a single penny, not a single rupee, not a single paisa had been spent on setting this up. So it was on, they recognized the problem. They knew they didn't want to be questioned. They needed an answer if they were questioned. And at the end of it, when nothing happened, they passed a law where they said, we will share everything other than biometrics. So the biometric database, as is the demographic database, these are completely unaudited systems. And these are known to be full of errors. This is the database with which the Election Commission wants to link the voter ID. Just think about what that means. There is a whole lot else, which I just thought some of this I'll set this up. Thanks, Padmini.
Thank you, Usha. So I had a question with regards to what does one do in the face of this, right? Like, much of the work that we're doing at One Vote is about making the citizen conscious of these developments and these, shortcomings and issues. But what can citizens actually do in terms of taking action in order to kind of push against these developments? Because we're seeing over the YouTube channel, there's a lot of faith in the EVM. Because it's technology, and people feel that, as a technology, it will be exact and correct, and therefore, not at fault. So how do we, what kind of instruments can we use to kind of take action and maybe push against this?
I think the kind of thing that we may need to do in relation to EVMs may be different from what we need to do in terms of the voter ID and UID link. For this reason, that EVMs are something that people encounter only during an election. It's only those who are working on it who are aware of, what kind of problems there could be. It's only someone who understands how software gets used in these systems who will have questions about, who will know how to ask the questions about it. It's only someone who understands the nature of the source code who will be able to tell us, what these issues are. So in the popular imagination, how you question a technology of this nature, so it's not that clear. It becomes a little clearer when we find that there are other countries in the world which have rejected it. Which countries you believe, all of us commonly believe in technology. So if they are saying no to it, then what are we missing? So that could be one kind of question. But on the voter ID, UID link, I find that actually people are just feeling pressured and pushed into a corner because, see, unlike the EVM, in the UID, everyone is being cornered into trying to work the system. I mean, if you look at the JPAL report, if you look at the JPAL report, that Karthik Muralidharan's report, you find that they say that, a large number of families are able to link their UID with the PDS because at least one of their fingerprints work. So if there's a family of 5 and there is one person whose fingerprint works, they are saying, okay, at least we're able to link it. So it's a deeply defective system and people are experiencing it. I was actually very surprised at a recent meeting which I attended on digitization, where I found that every person coming from the different sectors, whether it's labor or it is banking or it is agriculture or whatever, all of the food, work, everybody, they would say, for instance, on the social security code, that all unemployed or unorganized workers, everyone has to get onto that database. So they say, okay, you get onto the database. To do that, you have to give your UID. Then they want your bank number. Then they want your PAN. Then they want you to keep reporting to them about where you are. And all this has to be done through technology. And at the end of this, and throughout, from 2010 till now, they have, there has been no hiding. Even the UIDAI hasn't hidden this, that, fingerprints are a problem for migrant workers. Iris can be a problem, biometrics are a problem for migrant workers. So, this is slightly different for that reason that there are so many, people have just fallen off the map and nobody is even counting them anymore. People go to the ration shops every month and find themselves in trouble. So I think, with it's helplessness and choicelessness that is pushing people to have to do this. They are not doing it because they expect the system to work. They just know that they will be excluded if they don't somehow try to include themselves. That's the cruelty of the system. But that also makes it easier for people to understand.
All right, thank you so much. I think we have a question in the chat. What is the unique aspect of India's rule of law that makes the creation of this kind of citizen database possible in a state of exception?
See, I think we need to apportion some of that responsibility among different agencies. I think one of the things is that this is just my way of reading it, that it is correct that the state has a responsibility to make sure that everybody has what they need, not just to survive, but to be able to move on in life. Which means that if I'm in a PDS system today, 5 years or 10 years down the line, I should not need to be in that PDS system. If I have been below poverty line for a certain period of time, I should have been able to move out of the poverty line. I'm not sure we are calculating, we are looking at it like this. We are looking at trying to somehow make that system work, but we are not looking at what it will mean to get, so in my head, freedom from the state. And this does not in the libertarian sense, but freedom from the state in terms of not having them oppress me with UAPA or with whether I'm a minority or not, or whether it's whatever. That is a very important freedom. And it's a freedom that we have lost in large measure because we have participated, we have allowed ourselves to lose this, which means that, people will often ask, have you got yourself a mobile phone? And I say, no, they'll say, but how will you operate without it? I'm like, where is the problem? Is the problem that I don't have a mobile phone, or is it a problem that the system will not allow anyone to operate without it? And do you know the number of people in this country who don't have mobile phones? And if they're going to be maintaining that, the artifact becomes more important than what they need to get on in life. Isn't there a problem there? So I think in our there is a way. I keep saying this, but it's a strange thing that in this country, which taught the world non-cooperation, we are the most obedient that you can find. Which is why when people say we need systems like this so that there won't be anarchy, I can only laugh. Where is the anarchy? We are just much too obedient. It is that is a problem. I don't even mean it, there's a certain levity, of course, in that, but it is meant in seriousness too. Because if something is wrong, it's wrong. When Gandhi refused to follow the sedition, he said, the sedition law is bad. What I'm doing is not bad. The sedition law, so I can't obey. If I obey it, then I'm obeying something that I know is bad. How can I do that? Right? So, sorry for that abstract kind of thing, but it's a little bit of how we need to be able to ask ourselves questions. That's why.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Usha ji. If there are any more questions, we'll pass them on to you later. Thank you.
Sure.
Now we'll move on to our next speaker, Anand V, who will be speaking on how to fix an Indian election. So just a short biography of Anand. He worked in the corporate IT sector for 2 decades and is now a security and privacy researcher. He is also a director at HasGeek and writes about cybersecurity issues in several publications. So he has asked us to imagine that you are a political operative and you are given the task to ensure that a particular candidate wins the election with the following constraints. A, you can't hijack EVMs or hack them. B, you can't adopt violence to stop people from voting. How will you go about it? Anand's talk will cover how such an operative will work on the ground using a fusion of money, data, and boots on the ground from insights culled from the last 5 years. Thanks, Anand.
I will just go over the presentation if that works better. Yeah. Oh, hang on a minute. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, brilliant.
Right. All right. So this is basically not just a hypothetical scenario. This actually happens quite a lot. And most of the material that you find here is condensed. I mean, there's a lot more detail that ought to be said here, which I can't because this itself is like a several-hour talk. Yeah. So what I will just try to go about doing is first jump into definitions. So when we come back and say fix, it has a very different meaning. The meaning that we have in our head when we use word fix is hacking. And hacking is not what most of the people think it is. It's about basically getting a one-up advantage or changing a particular outcome the way in which we wanted, not as a certainty, but as a probability. So one way to think about how the definition here matters is that if you basically take a coin and say that, look, it's head or tail, 50-50. But what if you just basically tilt the coin such that the probability of you getting ahead is 70? It is not really fixing in terms of fixing immediately, but it is basically ensuring that if you play the game long enough, you would actually get a much higher advantage compared to your opponent. That is exactly how you have to think about the word fixing and hacking here. And that is exactly what you see in India on elections. Basically, the way in which they are run and the way in which it is being operated now of late essentially gives a very unfair advantage, right, to some party, and essentially gives a very put the other party in a very difficult situation. So the question that you then have to ask is, like, unfair for whom? The answer here is unfair for voters and unfair for the opposition parties. And then how do you ensure that this unfair advantage comes? The answer is by creating asymmetries. So that is really the definitional aspect of what we need to talk about now, right? So moving forward, there are three fundamental ways in which you can create these asymmetries. And all these asymmetries are linked together and they feed off each other. So the first information asymmetry that you have is information itself. And then there are institutional asymmetries, and which creates resource asymmetries. I mean, so if you look back and think about what these asymmetries fundamentally means, is that they tilt the election lay of the land itself much more towards the incumbent and very little and much worse towards the voter, and with a particular outcome when the game is being played long enough. That's the way in which you have to think about it, right? Look forward. So what does informational asymmetry mean in the context of how the election game is being played? So if you understand a fair contract is where the parties who enter into the contract have all information about each other. In an unfair contract, what happens is, right, one party knows much more about the other party, and that is what we call as informational asymmetry as. So if you take an example of the stock market, you come back and say insider trading is banned or at least illegal because the insiders, by being the very nature of insiders, have much more information than what is going on with the stock compared to any other outside parties. So information asymmetries in general are not looked upon very nicely, and there are various laws in place in order to ensure that it doesn't play too much. But in the case of elections, strangely, you will find that information asymmetry is never even talked about, right? And now let's take this information asymmetry problem into the voting issue. The voting is essentially a three-party problem where there is an incumbent, opposition, and an voter. And like it or not, the way in which the election works is that the voter has to choose between the incumbent and the opposition when the elections are held. It really doesn't matter whether the opposition is one party or many parties, or it doesn't really matter if the incumbent is again one party or many parties. There is the same problem. And so in the way in which elections nowadays work, information asymmetry ensures that the incumbent has a very higher advantage compared to the opposition, and the opposition also has a better advantage in a voter. So if you fundamentally take this problem and break it down, this is how the greater sign kind of a thing works, in the sense that the incumbent also has a much better advantage. So how does an operator ensure that the incumbent has a much higher information asymmetry? Let's dive deep into that. Okay. So the first interesting part about building an information asymmetry is to build more databases. That is not a surprise for people who have been doing this kind of work for a very long time, but it may actually come across as a surprise for many others. It's always about building more databases. The step 2 is to merge, share, and analyze them. And that part is also pretty obvious for operators. And I'll explain more about what it means. The step 3 is deny access to databases about yourself. So let us think about how step 3 works. Now, typically the way in which democracies are supposed to work is that regime change happens every X number of years. In some democracies, it's 3 years, some it's 4 years, some it's 5 years, whatever the number is. But most of the democracies are designed to create what we call as regime change. And the regime change happens in a particular cadence. And the way in which the information regime change works is that you are supposed to decide as a country, as an voter, what is good for your country based on whatever metrics that you choose about. And in most of the democracies, people like to get rich, or at least not poor. So they have a general sense of direction about how to go forward as a country, or how to go backward as a country, or whatever. And then they basically vote based on that, right? I mean, that's typically the operating theory. So in this aspect, if you look at it, commentators would come back and say, in general, if you are leading the country towards prosperity, where people are feeling a sense of direction, growth, happiness, incomes are growing, and they call it indicators. And there are quite a lot of indicators about these. Some are high frequency, some are low frequency, some are much frequently published, some are much less frequently published, and so on and so on. So this is basically the state of just not the economy, but the state of the country. So in general, when voters are supposed to make decisions about whether to vote the incumbent in or the opposition in, they need data. And the government actually has quite a lot of data about itself, or whoever is the ruling party has quite a lot of data about itself. So when you want to build an information asymmetry, which ensures the level playing field is tilted towards it, the incumbent typically does not give access to any data about its own performance, right? I mean, that is usually step 3. And then once you go into that mode, in step 4, you fundamentally try to tilt the level playing field by what we call as narrative control via targeted messaging. I'll go back to that. There is a very fixed process of doing narrative control, and I'll explain more to the extent time allows on that. And in step 5, what you have is you have institution control to entrench. And then, so if you look at the steps very sequentially, and it basically goes into a loop. You start off with building one database, you go and move to 2, then 3 and 4. At somewhere along the line, an inflection point comes, at which point of time, the institutions that you have created essentially work in your favor more and more, thus essentially entrenching your advantage for a very long time. That is how you build information asymmetry at an institutional level. It is harder to spot when it starts, just like how you see the COVID waves not being able to be spotted when it was like starting, but it multiplies and multiplies and multiplies. At some point of time, the inflection point afterwards, it's impossible for you to push back, or very difficult for you to push back. This is basically how information asymmetry as a process works. Yeah, let's go forward. Okay, so before we go into step 1 about why building more databases is very important, there are some fundamental e-governance laws that you need to understand about building databases, and these are not flippantly written stuff. This is actually what most of the people actually believe. Yeah, so the first and foremost rule in e-governance says that every problem can be solved by building a database eventually. That is the part that I skipped out. And if you fundamentally take the problem of building any database, be it PAN numbers or being a voter IDs or be it whatever, the first and foremost issue that they have is, at least in the modern world, when we see database, it is not good old paper and pen kind of a thing. It's modern digital databases. Building databases is a very hard and expensive procedure. And you typically try to build them using capital infused by the government via subsidies. And in general, because government is usually considered poor, you take the cheapest and the most viable option. It really doesn't matter what collateral damage you cause by doing that, because without that, no database will ever get built, and hence you would never succeed in the long run, and hence you would take whatever corner cutting that you do, no matter what the consequences are, right? And that is fundamentally because of the way in which the government subsidy becomes like a bottling factor in building a long-term database of any kind, right? And then what you then do is, it is just not sufficient for you to build it. You have to somehow operate them. And however, operating them is an operational expenditure via public-private partnerships with shared revenue model and capital appreciation. So I'll come back to it. And let's think through some of the interesting databases that we had built in the recent past, which people had great difficulty and trouble with, even after so many years. The first and foremost is the GST database, which of course everyone who ever files or runs a business and files returns is familiar about, and the kind of issues that it has been talked about you having to log in into the middle of the night and not working and so on and so on. A similar episode played out in the MCA database, which not many people were aware of. A similar issue of very recently that passed out was basically the income tax PAN database with a new portal and stuff like that. And so in essence, you have to really start wondering about how hard it is to create a database of PAN numbers and how hard it is to create a database of just income tax returns and collect tax filings. So in general, if you notice, the government is pretty good at only doing one thing, which is collecting money. And you really got to wonder if it is so hard to run and maintain databases that collect money from citizens, which is the primary job of any government, how hard it is for it to maintain and run other databases at scale. It turns out that it is way beyond its competence. So what it normally does is that it either creates a shell organization or gives it to L1 bidding and so on and so on. And no matter the operational route it takes, it is always a public-private partnership. Sometimes it's a shared revenue model, sometimes it's a fixed cost model, and sometimes with VC funding, creating digital economy kind of a thing, etc., etc. That is how it has always been with e-governance. Yeah. The fourth rule of e-governance is utility and accuracy increases with use. Well, again, use the word law. It is not a certainty. That is really the belief. So the way in which I should have probably written as e-governance beliefs, but that is what they believe as laws. And so we are basically understand that. So the primary here is why is this utility and accuracy increases with use thing came? Because if it fails often, people would shout, and if people shout often, someone would basically beat up someone, and then essentially ensure that the accuracy and utility over a period of time increases. I mean, of course, you could argue about the fact that, well, power matters here. Yes, it does, but this is what they believe, right? And of course, the last thing is use can be incentivized or coerced, which is another way of saying that either you pay people for it or they will be coerced to use it because there is no choice. And so here is the interesting thing about coercion. When people are coerced and they are not incentivized, the system basically gets marooned out of incentives, in the sense that because you're coerced, no matter what, there is no market kind of an exit option. And because there is no market exit option, you have no choice than to put up with the inanities that the system demands. And so the law number 4 of e-governance, that utility and accuracy increases with use, actually works in reverse when coercion is involved. When coercion is involved, utility and accuracy actually decreases with use, and the system falls apart. And you have no choice than to keep up with the system, because that is the price of living. I mean, unfortunately, that is how it works. So in this model, if you can understand very clearly, it is very visible that any system that has a mandatory opt-in with no opt-out will always, over a period of time, encounter issues, because its service quality will never improve. It will just keep falling apart. And that is something that will create more further problems for anyone who implements a system. But that is how it is. Yeah. So this is the fundamental of how you build databases when it comes to India, because these are observations that have been, I've just basically told them as laws, right? So let's talk about databases in the context of elections. There are quite a lot of databases in this country because we have prioritized building databases over service quality in the last decade or so. So let us think back about what kind of databases are available. So the first is an Voter ID databases. I mean, it typically has name, EPIC number, mobile number, date of birth, state, district, constituency, polling booth, and even other numbers. Because the ECI did quite a lot of linking even before the 2015 law came. And even after that, it did quite a lot of linking. And then they do a lot of cross-linking either without telling people. I mean, the consequence of that was seen in the Telangana elections on 2018, I think. Then there are quite a lot of other databases, which we call beneficiary databases. There are quite a few of them, but in general, they have caste religion, mobile number, bank accounts, Aadhaar number, and so on and so on. Then the third kind of database is actually from the private sector. These are basically telecom databases and bank databases and other kind of databases. They also have name, date of birth, mobile numbers, email IDs, ID card numbers of various kinds, and Aadhaar numbers. Then there are other databases that trade separately in the market, which we call as the Aadhaar mobile databases. Then there are student databases, club databases, hotels, entry registers, exit registers, and so on and so on. So if you look back about all these databases, most of these databases are available to you if you know where to look for, or you can buy them. For instance, if you look at the voter ID databases, people have been scraping and scrounging voter ID databases for quite a long time using various techniques. But of late, there is no such notion of private and public field in these databases, in the sense that there may be something hidden, but you can always get them if you know where to get from, right? A similar thing happens even in beneficiary databases. Beneficiary databases are also available in the market if you look for it. Me and my co-author Shivam, who collaborate on this, have tracked quite a lot of databases that are being traded in the market. You can buy them off in masse, particularly when elections are coming. Well, the accuracy is something that you have to determine over a period of time, but these are always available for a song. Yeah, the value goes up during election times and comes down later. And the interesting part about these databases is that you can also get them directly from the state hubs, or you can get from partners. I mean, there are various ways in which you can get them, which I will not go much into, but that is how it is. The telecom databases are interesting in the sense that there is quite a lot of places where you can find telecom database. These are typically sold by operators who are manning these stations, or sometimes it was vulnerability on those things, which allows them to do a massive scrapping, and so on and so on. Similarly, there are other databases which are also traded, and every time a data breach happens, there are operators who basically accumulate these databases and clean them up to some extent, do some mixing and matching, and sell it off for a higher value. So this is the fundamental problem when it comes to fixing elections or hacking elections, as an electoral hacking, as we call it, where you get to access a lot of databases. And what this database actually tells, when mixed and matched with people, is that it can reveal a lot about how a voter votes, right? And what can sway the voter. That's what it is, right? Step two. Once you have access to all the databases, whether you procure them or you get them directly, it really doesn't matter. You are supposed to do merge, share, and analyze. And the process of merge, share, and analysis works by having a common identifier across all these databases. One of the most commonly used identifiers are actually mobile numbers and Aadhaar numbers. And if you look at mobile numbers, it is actually a pretty prized asset in information control. And it is fundamentally enabled by this OTP each that India has got, where for no matter, even if you want to buy a milk from Big Basket or any of those places, you have to give them a mobile number. And you want to go buy exercise equipment in some exercise shop, they will ask you for a mobile number. You're going to go buy Tatkari in some place, they will ask you a mobile number, and so on and so on. So what fundamentally happens is that a mobile number is basically like a static identifier, which everyone gets a lot. So when you try to do a mixing and matching of databases, this is one thing that they use as a common identifier, right? But the hard problem about mobile numbers when it comes to elections and voting is that unlike most, we have noticed on the field that mobile numbers change and recycle a lot. But other numbers don't recycle at the same rate. So when we basically say don't, remember we're talking about this abstract idea called rate of change. Quite a lot of people's mobile numbers change if they belong to a particular economic strata. And as you go higher and higher and higher on the economic strata, your mobile numbers don't change. This is empirical observation on the field. So if you go back and look at one of the things that I actually track, this is called as a mobile and Aadhaar number linked databases, which if you basically go back and look at it, when there were many telecom operators, the accuracy is about 15% to 10%. What it means is that the database that you get and the database that it is actually linked to don't actually have a match because the numbers recycle a lot. As the telecom vendors become a duopoly or tripoly or whatever it is you call it, the accuracy is increased now up to 25 to 30%. And the accuracy again goes higher with economic strata, but that is how it is. right? So what is the next step? So when people come and say, but apart from dark databases, trade market, etc., how are these databases shared? Sometimes you simply ask them, but there are two public case studies that I want to discuss about. One is the Seva Mitra app that TDP made in Andhra in the last elections. I mean, it is a public source. You can, I will probably click and go back to it, or probably not required. So if you look back, the Seva Mitra app, what they did is they basically got a full dump of the state database hub from Andhra. And remember the public architecture here about the state data hub. It is basically another database which UIDAI sends them frequent updates, on top of which every state-run beneficiary database is linked with it. So in essence, what has happened here is a political party, which was actually running the government, was able to ensure that all the data that the government had in its state data hub was leaked to the political party, but not to the opposition. And so this became like a big issue. So one thing that kind of people got very interested about is about color photos and whatnot. And so cadres basically walked road by road, street by street, collecting numbers and databases, and whether they're a polling booth linked, etc., etc. So the Seva Mitra app, if you look at it, had databases from the state government, had scheme database, then they had voting ID list, because that is always made available to the political parties. Then there was street-to-street surveys, where they walk around and figure out which is where, and there was an app made for it, and there was an analysis made for it. The UIDAI admitted it and said it was stolen, but they never wanted to tell about how it is stolen. And no one ever investigated it after that, right? So this is the first case study. The second public case study was on Pondicherry, the recently concluded elections, where there were a bunch of activists who basically linked their Aadhaar numbers to a mobile phone, which they did not give it to anywhere else. And before they know it, they were getting WhatsApp chat group invitations for those mobile numbers. And so the Madras High Court investigated it. Throughout the UIDAI's response as not sufficiently good enough, and it ordered an investigation. And it just so happened that the judge who was basically on the bench, who was the Chief Justice of Madras High Court, got transferred for reasons no one knows about. So this, in a sense, is basically what you're looking at, in the sense that for all practical purpose, an incumbent fundamentally has access to an incumbent party, not the government, because those two are supposed to be different, fundamentally has access to all information about you. And we'll go further on what it means for the secret ballot itself. And so just think about what I told you so far. Databases can be bought, databases can be traded, databases can be given, or databases can be taken. And this is because of step one, right? And of course, if you go back, what is the step 3 I talked about on how to fix an election as an operator? You had to deny access to databases about yourself, which is fundamentally about government performance and what they're doing and where is the money. I mean, all the usual stuff that you call yourself as democracy. There are several recent examples. I will not go much into it. So the first was about the NSSO survey, where there was an internal survey which from the statistical organization, which said we had the worst unemployment in the last 40 years, and it was never released. And the principal statistical scientist resigned over that, and it got leaked. There were several changes in RTI Act, which fundamentally ensures that citizens have accountability towards democracies, which nowadays come back to most of the time as no data available, not requested, exemption. So those things have increased quite a lot. And then there is also quite a bit of controversies on the GDP backdated stuff, where the methodology is being questioned, whether growth is being really growth, and so on and so on. So what you now have is at step 3, more data about voters and less data about the government. That's really what you're looking at, right? And step 4, this is the interesting part about targeted messaging and analysis. So what you do here is that at the end of every election, polling booth data is available. So in the past, when there were physical ballots that were being used, or before the EVMs came in, they would basically take all the ballot papers, put it in the central counting place and mix it up. And this is in the form of anonymization. So what it really means is that since there is no polling data available at a booth level, you can't do targeted analysis or analytics. And of course, in those days, there's no such huge databases. So the very speed problem and the analog problem of paper has fundamentally made democracy stronger. And people have really not understood the extent of that, because if you have paper and you have less databases, your democracy is much stronger, because it is very difficult for the political party to have voting information about yourself. But of course, you can always question in the modern days, services, digitalization and all is required. But the thing that really is important about digitalization is we can still do a lot of targeted prediction based on polling booth data, because even after EVMs, polling data at every EVM is actually published out, right? So what it really allows is it allows a lot of mathematical techniques to be used for predictions, because remember, I have a lot more data about you than you about me. So the first thing what they normally do is they assign this thing called a Panna Pramukh. Panna Pramukh is a very old construct. My dad used to be a polling worker on 1960s, maybe. And it was as old as that. I remember him telling me about doing poll booth working then. And the way in which it works is that you take a voter database, or voter list as they call it in those days, you print them on a piece of paper, or you do cyclo style in the olden days. And let us say there are 500 people on a polling booth. And then you take 50 at a time, and then you say that this 50% tell me what is the leaning. I mean, so the Panna is a page. You assign the one worker of the party whose job is to basically figure out the people whom he is responsible for, what are their leanings. Okay, so this is how it used to be even on the paper side. So nothing new about it, you may say, but let's go back further, right? So what you do is you just basically mark down leanings. In the olden days, it used to be leanings based on whether he's a member and caste and so on and so on. That's the same thing exists even now. And then, but in the modern day, what you do is you do statistical analysis, and you can do Markov analysis and so on and so on. You start with the prior and you say assign a probability. And then when the data comes back after the poll, you adjust. And so what you're doing in this process is that your probability of what the voter is going to vote and their leanings is actually getting much more sophisticated over a period of time, right? So I'll give a very small example with what I call as a 3-voter problem, because it's much easier for you to understand. You just have to extend it mathematically to n-voter problem, but it's essentially the same, right? So you take a polling booth, let us say there are 3 voters in it, and then we just took about 2 parties. There is voter 1, there's voter 2, and then there's voter 3. And the way in which analysis process works is that you write down the leanings and you say, what is the probability this person is going to vote for me? And then you do what is called as an expectation analysis. And so here what you do is you write it down and say, okay, it really doesn't matter what party I'm actually being given as a polling booth consultant. I just say one is BJP, one is INC, and one is neutral. And depending on which party I'm working on, I'm going to say that no matter what, the net result of this polling booth data is 1/3, right? So at this point of time, the way in which targeted messaging works is that you do something like this, right? You basically now get access to a whole lot of databases. Remember, that is step 1 and step 2. So you start writing like this. You say leanings, you write, I mean, is this person getting a subsidy in MNREGA? Is this person getting an LPG subsidy? Is he getting a Kisan subsidy? Is he getting a scholarship custody? What is his caste, right? And then you write down all the leanings. And then you come back and say, now what, right? In order to win, you only have 3 options. The option number 1 is to sway the neutral to vote for you. The option number 2 is suppress the opponent. The option number 3 is make your leaner, the person whom you lean to, vote out. So this is what is called as a get out to vote campaign, right? And so if you look back, what this allows is, it allows you to do custom crafting of messages. You can come back and say, well, vote for me because you got so much of scholarship from you. Vote for me because I gave you so much of MNREGA. Or you come back and say to the other person, vote for me because maybe I'll give you higher reservation for your caste. Or in order to ensure the other person suppress, you just basically spread information oh, he's not an endangering person. So what kind of crafted messaging can I send him, right? And then so remember at this point of time, the features that I've written out, what is called endangering, LPG, Kisan, scholarship, cash, are only mere markers. A typical campaign may probably have about more than 20, 25, 30 data points about every voter. And so this allows you to do a lot of interesting stuff. And I will not go into how messages in campaigns are started because it's a very distinct talk by itself. But this is the essential strategy about how to do targeted messaging. Now, coming back to it, there is also an adjustment process here that I will not go deep into because it will take too long a time for it. So the way in which it works is that, let us say you got this 1 by 3, and then what really happened on the polling data is that when you go back to the EVM and you vote, and then they do the totalizer machines, they don't actually totalizer machines as a construct would have probably given much more anonymity for the secret ballot, but that doesn't exist no more. So what then you do is you adjust. You say that, okay, I'm supposed to get 1 by 3, but I actually got 2 by 3. Maybe the neutral whom I thought was a neutral is probably not a neutral, but he has my leaning. So you just basically go back and adjust the neutral status to 1.0 or 1.0. And so this is basically how you do it. And so even when you run membership campaigns and all that kind of stuff, remember the first and foremost thing they talk about on the membership campaigns or even missed call campaigns is that, please give me a missed call. I mean, at the end of it, no matter what your targeted messaging is, the mobile number is like an absolute base. And so when people come and talk about JAM, Jandan and Aadhaar and mobile, they fundamentally forget about the fact that the M is the most crucial component for political parties. And what enables the M is what everything else does. So if you find a whole bunch of farmers or a whole bunch of people not pretty unhappy with you 6 months before the elections, when you're running ground polls, you can always announce a direct subsidy for that kind of people. And the fact that you haven't done it so far doesn't mean anything. But I actually expect these things to be much more operational going forward because of the change in the voter ID linking thingy, right? And then the beauty of targeted messaging is that you can pursue all of this simultaneously, sway the neutral, suppress the opponent, make a leaner to vote. I mean, how the magic in India has always been WhatsApp groups. So you can look at a single example here. I'll just show the single example here. Just a minute, if it is screen. So if you look back, if it must be audible for me, at least the tweet, or should I just?
No, I can't see the
Okay,
screen. Yeah.
Maybe I probably had to do it. Okay, so hang on a minute. Yeah, is it now?
Yeah, we can see it now.
Okay, so if you look at this message, there is something very interesting. I mean, for those who don't understand Tamil, I will just translate what it is. It just says injustice, and then the poor is being denied their livelihood, and so on and so on. But notice the amount of exclamation marks here. And if you understand Tamil, a similar thing that we have seen in many campaign messages, it's exceptionally emotional. And so this is an example of how WhatsApp messages are basically sent. I'll resume now. Hang on a minute. Okay. I'll resume now. Going back, so one is WhatsApp groups. There are quite a bit of information about WhatsApp groups and how they are managed. Again, it's like a several hour talk. I will not go into that. Then how will you get targeted messaging done? I mean, you do what is called as random bombing via media. Then you do one-to-one canvassing. A similar kind of thing happened in the farmer protest. There were quite a bit of one-to-one canvassing, but not by the people who supported it, by the people who opposed it. So if you understand the modus operandi by combining data, fusing it with databases, and fusing it with this Panam kind of an architecture, and then doing prior and backdating, you fundamentally get a pretty good idea on who's voting. And this is primarily enabled by the totalizer machines, not the absence of totalizer machines. So let's go back. What is the way to build targeted messaging? The way to build targeted messaging happens via what is called as focus groups. So what you do is you pick 2 or 3 persons per polling booth and then run quite a lot of focus groups. You basically figure out a bunch of messages, and the golden rule about messages is it has to be emotional, directed, and simple. And this is also situated in a larger context called as the ON3C framework. And so this is an example of objective, narrative, context, campaign, content. I will not go too deep into it, but the simple fact of the matter is that I've seen this ON3C framework and targeted messaging work many times over. It doesn't really matter it is for the ruling party or the opposition, it is work for incumbents, it is work for opponents, and so on and so on. So when you are facing this kind of a messaging problem, what do you do as an opposition? You run counter campaigns, you do tap into data trade markets, and sometimes it just so happens that the other side also leaks information about their campaigns to you. So this basically has become more mercenary and driven largely by political consultants. You would really want to look at what they are doing. In terms of their sophistication, it has increased by several notches in the last 5 years ever since we've been tracking this. And so if you go back and ask the first question, I had met a TDP campaign consultant and who, when the Seva Mitra thing exploded, and he explained to me like this, and he said, what do I do? The other side is bringing guns to a fight. Am I supposed to just go and fight them with bows and arrows? So we did what we have to do, which is the explanation for the Seva Mitra thing. So in general, if you look at what has happened is, this is basically an escalation of loss of privacy for citizens. And the very fact that everyone is doing it doesn't mean that it is actually right. Because we had a similar kind of an issue during the paper voting thing, when ballot stuffing was pretty common and so on, etc. Right? So the ECI did a lot of interesting stuff during these days in order to bring it down. So we are probably looking at something like that. But whether they would do it, I don't know. Right? So the last step I would discuss, and then we'll just move on to the conclusion. I think it should be right on time. So what last step is, if you want to achieve until step 4 and you got into a place where you are winning a lot of elections one way or the other, you use institutional control in order to entrench your advantage. And so an example for that is the ongoing debate about the PDP, where the government basically said, look, we don't want to give data about ourselves, so we just want to be exempt from all the PDP stuff, right? I mean, UIDAI is one of the examples. The government can basically exempt itself from the entire PDP law, which fundamentally means it doesn't have to care about data protection anymore, because it thinks that giving data about itself and telling people and having more data about people is pretty good for it, right? And of course, you see the next thing, which is pass laws which allow easy merge by common identifiers. And so that is really what the ECA the other epic card linking is all about. What is now actually mostly done hush-hush by campaign consultants and political parties by tapping into data trade markets and hack and leak or leak and buy and whatnot, is basically now being legalized. That's the way in which I would read it, right? And of course, the last part of the institutional control is the judiciary itself, where it comes back and says it decides cases by not deciding about it. We are not seeing this.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're way beyond time, so if you can wrap up quite soon.
Yeah, this is the last thing. Yeah. So we are almost done. So just to think about, if I were an operator, how do I do it? This is how I would do it, and this is what is actually also happening on the field. So think about this fact that voters have always been least informed and have the least power by design. Technical solutions like Aadhaar, blockchain, etc., don't address information's asymmetry problem and hence worsen it. The easy availability of data also worsens power asymmetry as well, right? I think we're done. Questions?
Great, thanks, Anand. I'm afraid we don't have time for questions right now. Will you be able to stick around till the break at 5 p.m. and people can ask questions then?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much. Okay, we'll just move on to the next speaker, who is Nayanthara Ranganathan, who will be speaking on examining the relevance of political advertising and transparency. About Nayanthara, she is a lawyer and a researcher studying the politics and culture of digital technologies. She co-founded Persuasion Lab, a project exploring new forms of political propaganda on social media. And today she'll be talking about ad tech, which now mediates many aspects of democratic processes, conceptual frameworks and governance models, for example, rights to political participation, campaign finance, that enable the imagination of a functional electoral system are remade in the image of digital marketing. In her talk, she will explore the significance of some of these developments alongside the promise and letdowns of political advertising transparency as a framework of response. The talk is based on a body of work developed at Persuasion Lab, known as ad.watch. Just a quick note that the next speaker, who is TVS Sashidhar, will not be able to join us today. And so Nayanthara will be speaking till 5 p.m. Thanks so much, Nayanthara.
Thanks, Padmini. Can you hear me okay?
All good.
I'm going to talk about political advertising transparency as a framework of response that has emerged in response to some of the issues that have come up around social media and elections. So political parties have always advertised on different kinds of mass media, whether it is radio or TV, on the streets. This is not necessarily new. But more recently, these days we also see on social media platforms, there is a lot of propagation of election promises, of posturing and so on. And simply understood, ads on social media are essentially content that the advertiser pays the platform to circulate more than what it would normally circulate. So in this talk, I mainly focus on Facebook political advertising, which is also quite prevalent in the Indian political context. So what is different or what has changed from earlier forms of advertising? Now, without making it sound like it is social media is exceptional in that kind of way, that because even when it came to newspapers and so on, there was always this question of how advertising revenue would influence editorial choices and so on. So not to make it super exceptional, but to just understand what is different when it comes to social media ads. What you see on the left on the screen is basically one of the ad campaigns what content kind of to talk about in the middle of so we encounter mostly in there is a hyperlink typically kind of slogans.
Nayanthara, there seems to be a lot of lag. Would you mind turning your video off?
Hi.
Yeah, we missed a lot of the information on this slide. So maybe if you turn your video off, your bandwidth would be better. Thanks.
Yeah, just sorry, 1 second. Sorry, give me a second.
Sure.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with where I was with this slide.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Cool. So I was talking about what is different in social media advertising as compared to previous forms of advertising. That what you see on the left now, for example, is one of the advertisements one of the campaign ads of the BJP around the 2019 elections, where it is essentially, even in the content of it, targeted towards first-time voters and talking about how data is cheap under Modi's government and so on. So typically what we encounter is a video or a photo with a hyperlink that leads outside and maybe a slogan and so on. But what we don't end up encountering is what you see on the right, which is the political advertising transparency data from Facebook about this ad. So it goes into a lot more detail about who ended up seeing it, what was the demographics, what was the gender, for example, or the regional distribution of the people that saw the ads. So this is kind of what is not very easily accessible for a viewer. Now in 2018, after the Cambridge Analytica revelations, where basically it was revealed that an analytics firm used Facebook products to build voter profiles and target users, essentially just use Facebook in the way that it was meant to be used. So Facebook had to respond to this kind of public reckoning with their platform. And that was the moment in which political advertising transparency was offered as like a solution by Facebook. So in other words, I'm trying to say that it's important to locate political advertising transparency as a response that emerged as a PR move, as a damage control and a marketing move by the largest marketing platform in the world. So I'm going to now look at the problematics with political advertising as a category and with transparency as the response. Now, transparency is something that is available only for ads that are classified as political. And the politicalness of ads is determined by Facebook by looking at two kinds of things. One, either who is creating the ads, or second, what the ads are about. Now, before, of course, going into the question of who gets to decide what is political, the very fact that all of these ads circulate in targeted or optimized for engagement kinds of ways arguably makes all ads on the platform inherently political. But in any case, Facebook essentially carves out this neat category of political ads by creating this kind of binary between commerce and advocacy. So it says that all ads that are commercial in nature are not political ads, and therefore transparency data will not be available about them. Whereas all advocacy related ads will be considered political, and therefore there will be some higher degree of information revealed about it. And now, yeah, so it sounds like basically like a recipe for willful ignorance, but in practical terms, this is how it plays out. So on the screen, you will see an ad by Shell that talks about more trees, read how nature can play a vital role in the fight against climate change. I'm not sure what that means. And basically on the right, you have like a community organization talking about encroachment in forests and so on. So the one on the right is of course classified as political, and the one on the left is not. There are, just for some more examples, basically a merchandising kind of company that talks about Black Lives Matter would not be considered political. But a Black Lives Matter group that talks about COVID restrictions in schools gets classified and so on. So basically, it is in Facebook's interest to keep the numbers of political ads low, as the demands for its transparency and therefore intervention into Facebook's advertising infrastructure remains minimal. And in a US Senate hearing, I think in 2020, Zuckerberg admitted that less than 1% of the firm revenue is from political ads. Of course, in that context, he was trying to say that I think it was in the context of allowing for misinformation within political ads or something like that, to say that they are not doing it in the interest of monetary benefit, that actually political ads make up for a very small percentage of their firm's revenue. But I think what that also reveals is that it is in Facebook's interest that actually Facebook is only classifying 1% of all of its ads as political ads. Okay, so yeah, and in India, basically there are all kinds and all levels of campaigning that happens. And there are so many actors that straddle these kind of easy binaries between commerce and advocacy. There are outfits like news organizations that on the face of it have a news facade that end up doing different kinds of campaigning. There are booth level entities and groups and all kinds of things. So to adapt political ads as a relevant category of governance, even when we're talking about social media, I think is something that I think is a bit questionable. And now I'm going to move on to why transparency also, in fact, might actually distract from what might be needed as a governance response. So since 2019, Facebook has been providing certain tools through which it seeks to provide more transparency. And one of them is the Facebook Ad Library API. Now, this is, we use the Facebook Ad Library API at the AdWatch project and basically collect data about political ads. Now, there are a number of issues about the accessibility itself of the API and the kind of verification procedures that one needs to undergo in order to access it, but I won't get into that. I will just go in a little bit deep into the parameters of data that are available and actually like where those fingers are pointing or what actually that data reveals. So on the left is just like an image of a snapshot of the JSON format data that I captured. So the syntax or something is kind of maybe helpful. And on the right is on the right is some of the parameters of data that are available. So the ID, it starts with I'm starting here with the ID, which is basically a unique identifier for each advertisement. The ad snapshot URL leads to the creative, that is the visual content of the ad when you click on it. The ad creative body is the text that accompanies a particular ad, and link title and link caption have to do with any hyperlinks that you put on it. So this is mostly like infrastructural in the sense of creating a different identifier for each ads and things like that. And the second group is essentially the time at which an ad was created. And of course, the time at which it was created is different from the start and stop time, because I can create an ad today and say like only started in February and so on. And then there is the currency in which the ad has been bought, the funding entity that has bought the ad, the page unique identifier and name, the publisher platform. So like this Facebook advertising infrastructure is not just limited to Facebook, but also its family of products that is like Instagram, Messenger, as well as Audience Network. Audience Network is essentially uses Facebook advertising infrastructure to serve ads outside of Facebook products. So if you have an ad in Practo or something like that, they can, for example, use Audience Network for it to serve ads on Practo. And finally, the language in which the ads are created. So the second kind of paragraph or the second group of parameters are essentially, you could say, are advertiser choices, whatever the advertiser has done or is identified with and so on. Now, what kind of seems to be juicy information of demographic distribution and region distribution is actually a bit of the demographic distribution and the region distribution essentially tells you the outcomes of the targeting process. So it's not necessarily what the advertiser intended, but what actually ended up happening. So I could, as Greenpeace, create an ad and be like, serve this ad about, disappearing mangrove forest to 10 people. And if those 10 people only happen to be young 20-year-olds, that is a decision that that we can see with this data. So it's not necessarily revealing anything about the platform choices or even about the advertiser choices, but just the outcomes of it. And finally, the 3 parameters in red is in the form of a range. So the transparency data is not one number, but it is a range. So it could be like 0 to 100 rupees has been spent to reach 5,000 to 10,000 people and so on. And the relationship between spend and impressions, I think, is the most important or like the most revelatory kind of thing that Facebook provides, but also in the form of a range and not really in a specific way. So all of this to say that in totality, if you look at what is actually being revealed, this is not so much how or why I received a particular ad, or how or why an ad was received by a particular person at a particular time, chosen from like millions or billions of ads that might be running at that particular moment. It only points towards advertiser choices and not much about the platform. And as more and more advertisers outsource the job of defining audiences to Facebook. So earlier what used to happen was, some years back, there was a lot more targeting to say that, I don't know, target young mothers in the region of Bangalore, for example. But now with Facebook's advertising infrastructure getting more sophisticated, often what a lot of advertisers do is just to say, here is X amount of money. I would like to reach Y amount of people. How you do it, what determinations happen there is none, like they don't bother themselves. The advertisers don't bother themselves with that information. So this kind of optimization that Facebook does in choosing the most optimal ad for a particular person to see is a decision that still is very much as much of a black box, even in the presence of all of this transparency data. And to that extent, this kind of data might even be like a distraction from the actual important stuff. So yeah, compare this with what a Facebook president of ads, I think, said, VP of ads said, that there are close to 2 million data points that go into the determination of why a particular ad reaches a particular place. So that is, if that is the degree of data crunching that happens with ML models and so on, is transparency the response, or is this I don't know, is that all that we need to tackle the issue? So for example, with the model code of conduct that was recently, I think, revised, it says there shall be no appeal to caste or communal feelings for securing votes. But a process of Facebook advertising is by design and necessarily an appeal to different kinds of categorizations, whether implied or explicit. And so how does, how should I don't know, governance of these kind of advertising platforms be seen when these are some, like these kind of biases are something that happens by design? So I guess I will stop with the questions of who decides the viewership of particular kinds of political messaging. Should it be necessarily so individuated and isolated and fragmented? And what is the kind of bigger picture that is missed in the presence of only seeing content that is optimized for engagement and growth of Facebook? And what does that mean for I don't know, rights to political participation and for different kinds of political goals? And I guess the main question of is the present political advertising transparency framework, that is an outcome of a PR move and like a distraction, that is something being massively adopted. Is that the way to deal with these issues? Yeah, and this presentation builds on a body of work developed at AdWatch with my colleague Manuel, who I think is also here. Okay, I think that's it.
Thanks so much, Nanda. So while we wait for questions from the audience, obviously the work that you've done at AdWatch also has looked at kind of international trends in terms of political advertising. Could you say a little more about kind of how they compare with the Indian scenario and what is maybe specific or unique, if there are any such features for the Indian context as compared to the international context?
Right. I think the first thing that comes to mind is that I think 3-4 years ago, while it was quite newly being investigated, like political ads and advertising in general, the US banned targeting on the basis of race, gender, and a couple of other things for advertisements relating to housing, healthcare, social security. I don't know, like 2, 3, 4 things that was only implemented in the US, for example. And at that point, these were not even necessarily categorized as political ads. But now you can see in the, I think in the specifications kind of table that Facebook provides, that they had to create a separate category called housing and healthcare ads or something like that in order to operationalize this this principle of not discriminating on those characteristics. So I think that, of course, remained right, just applied there. But what I mean to say is that one doesn't need to be limited to the definitions of the categories of the frameworks that are forwarded by the platforms, but can in fact kind of go beyond that, I think. But yeah, that's the first one that comes to mind. But mostly also, I think even across the world, political advertising transparency has been, I think, as far as I don't know, regulatory intervention has gone within that sense. But I might be mistaken about more recent developments.
Great. Manuel, do you want to add anything if you're here? Okay. I was also wondering, I mean, obviously we have a very diverse media environment in India, and, you know, obviously kind of varying levels of literacy, etc. So kind of, is there a kind of, you know, say a context collapse or a kind of convergence with the way that these ads kind of travel inside and outside Facebook, right? Like, so you did mention that obviously Facebook's own kind of family of, you know, say Instagram, for example, will be places that these advertisements are shared, but also kind of the relationship with things like, you know, kind of TV news, WhatsApp messages, etc. Do you have a sense that, you know, these advertisements actually travel outside the kind of Facebook environment, or is there kind of a footprint or impact that's possible to maybe not measure, but kind of understand as another kind of vector of influence, maybe?
I wouldn't say the Facebook ads necessarily travel out as much as they're part of like the larger fabric of propaganda and misinformation. So we know, like, for example, that a lot of Twitter trends make it to broadcast TV kind of news. And we've, of course, in the more recent reports, seen how these are manipulated and so on. So I guess, yeah, also thinking about what Anand was speaking in the previous talk about the focus group discussions to look at what are the kind of optimal targeting narratives to have and so on. So I'm sure all of that goes into creation of these, well, of ad campaigns and so on. So I think I definitely see it as part of the larger media landscape that functions, but not necessarily that like Facebook ads on its own have the power to like sway X or Y.
And I think kind of jumping off from that, there's a question in the chat, which is how do you see political advertisement ecosystems go beyond Facebook into domestic Indian platforms such as ShareChat and Co?
That's a great question. I think there's platform design only is so different with things like ShareChat, and like you just have like the inroad to it is the form is not necessarily, I think, advertising so much as what platforms like to call organic reach, which is also algorithmic. and not in the trees or something. But yeah, I think just like system design wise, platform design, I don't know much about Coup, but which especially there was not so much when we also looked at share chat briefly during the 2019 elections. But it was like a totally different kind of landscape. And I think the ways in which it's used is also much more different, because Facebook has for a while been working on its advertising infrastructure, so that is kind of sophisticated. But with ShareChat, there were just different kinds of languages and kind of user-generated content that then traveled a lot depending on people that picked it up. So there's, of course, also that kind of crowdsourced, in a way, narratives that come up. So I don't know how to compare the two. And I don't think political ads in that sense exist on different platforms. I think Coup is itself an initiative to an extent that comes with its own kind of leanings, and that can be said of Facebook too. But I just mean to say that I think I find it a bit difficult to apply this kind of political ads framework in its crystallized way across platforms.
Right, yes, that makes sense. So I was also wondering, is there a kind of an imbrication of misinformation / disinformation and political advertising? Like, is there a way in which, I mean, legislatively or otherwise, I mean, we really don't have any safeguards, but can one be flagged up as misinformation or disinformation? Where is that kind of Venn diagram?
I think some years back, that was the big debate about whether like misinformation or disinformation that is part of political speech should be censored by platforms. And I think Facebook took the one extreme of saying we will allow it. And I think, I don't recall exactly who it was, but I think there was very much a very prominent case in India also, many places of political speech containing lots of misinformation. But yeah, I think there also the responses have been very much about content moderation centric, which is again a distraction from more, I guess, algorithmic kind of models and what kind of responses they need. So it again becomes this question of takedowns and then about like how do you spot these kinds of speech, and it becomes a very systems or like a very it's a computer problem kind of a. It's a computer solution kind of a problem. Yeah, I guess that's all I have to say about that.
Right, and we have a question from Ria. Do you have a sense of the scale at which political advertising in India is managing to bypass FB's categorization of being marked as a political ad? And what would an ad like that look like? So are these, for example, more likely to contain questionable content, misinformation, or disinformation? I think this goes back to what you were saying earlier in the talk, that something might not explicitly present itself as a political ad, but it is political in what it is trying to achieve.
Right, that's a great question. I think they definitely do not have a sense of the scale, but have a sense that it exists. But it also depends what one would ourselves consider political ads. So of course, there is a lot of advertising that falls outside of the categorization, but we are not able to measure that because that is not part of transparency data. So we're only able to anecdotally look at that within the graphical ad library interface, which does not allow for more like systematic kind of understanding. But yeah, for example, I think it's quite common for example, like even Coup is a big advertiser, I think, on Facebook very often, and yeah, it's just like lots of funny things happen. And my colleague had discovered this, that Modi heaters that keeps coming into political ads, right? Like the ad about this very old kind of geyser, sorry, not heater. But like so much else kind of falls off the map. But it's really, I don't know, I think there needs to be some kind of subversive method to understand the scale of things, which I think was possible because with understanding what is the number of political ads in total in Facebook because of the statement by Zuckerberg. But otherwise, I think I don't know what the scale is, but it definitely is pretty massive.
Right. I think we also have an observation regarding WhatsApp's relationship to Facebook, and WhatsApp's entry into digital payments via UPI lets them have access to real names, which are used in bank accounts, which are also the same from Aadhaar/Epic. So Meta's and Facebook's kind of parent company, Meta's capability after Voter ID, UID link increases. So I think there's obviously a kind of relationship there, and I wonder, whether that also feeds into the data of, Facebook's own kind of targeting as well.
I think in the API where you can look for different publisher platforms, there is also WhatsApp, but of course it doesn't throw up any results, but at least infrastructurally it is possible, or it is kind of envisioned, or I don't know how you want to interpret it, but WhatsApp is also kind of envisioned as a publisher platform for ads at some point, or so yeah, I'm sure there are other things there happening with data sharing, but that's the concrete thing. We know that it's part of some backend infrastructure.
Right, great. Thank you so much. We have another question, which is, if Facebook is categorizing a lesser number of ads as political, does it run the risk of running into some kind of accountability tangle, running with the law or the new social media intermediary guidelines?
As far as I know, with the intermediary guidelines, I don't think it necessitates political advertising transparency, but I'm also not that conversant with it, so I'm not sure. But I think Facebook is, I think it's definitely in its benefit to classify fewer as political ads, both because it wouldn't have to be transparent about the rest of it, as well as any problems that might come within the data that is then revealed about these ads. Yeah.
And I think this will be our last question. Would political ad making qualify as gig work, which would make the relationship between Facebook and other platforms and the government requiring reinterpretation?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think so, because political ads typically, like a lot of these content marketing firms do it, and I don't think it happens as gig work, because it does require, I mean, it's not itinerant, and I don't think like it works in the same way as gig work. That's just my sense though.
Great. Okay, thanks so much, Nayantara. So at 5 o'clock, we are going to take a break, but there will also be, if you're interested, a breakout session, which will be run by the Rethink Aadhaar group, which will go until around 5:45. So you have a choice. You can either take a break and come back at 5:30, which is when the break actually ends. You can join the breakout session, which will start now and then go on maybe till around 5:45 or later. And if you stick around, there will also be some quizzes and polls to keep the audience engaged. Also, we did have some questions for Anand that we couldn't take because of paucity of time. So I think we could also address those now. But if you are going for a break, please come back at 5:30 to join us. Anand, would you be available to take the questions? I think he might be away from
Hang on a minute. Yeah, you can.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I think one of the questions that was asked was about the decentralization of governance and what your idea around that might be.
I don't know. I mean, we are supposed to be pretty decentralized, no? Isn't that the federal constitution kind of a thing?
Yes, I mean, we don't have much context for that question. So,
yeah, I mean, we're supposed to be a lot more
federalist
federalist and a lot more decentralized. And what has happened of late is it has become exceptionally centralized. So if you look back, what has happened? Most of the welfare schemes that are being run now are being pushed from the center by taking money from the states themselves, which becomes a problem for the states, because at the end of it, being the closest to the people, the states are responsible for delivery. And the center usually writes down policies. That's the way it is. I don't know, but even ECI is supposed to be much more decentralized, with state commissioners and so on and so on. So that is with the Voter ID-Aadhaar thinking, that is also becoming more centralized. So what you have is a problem in the sense that policies are being more made in the center and implementation has to be done in the states. But here, both implementation and policies are basically made by the center, which fundamentally means states don't have much say, not just on policy, but also implementation, which makes governance much worse overall.
Another question that we had was, don't the current or imminent personal data protection laws exempt government agencies from processing personal data? It seems like agencies invested in voter ID, Aadhaar linking for targeted voter profiling, for example, in Telangana, are retroactively immune from legal consequences. Yes. And in a similar vein, what are we to do when legislation infringing on our rights are passed without any meaningful discussion and robust oversight mechanisms, especially with elections around the corner?
Well, I think, see, we have a larger problem in general, which is, if you look at all democracies all around the world, there had been severe regression steps on the rights framework. Okay. What that fundamentally means is that you have to think about rights framework as a means to ensure there is accountability built into government itself. Now we are seeing increasingly that accountability checks being absent. Most of the government policies are actually not getting the results. I mean, which is supposed to be, like you saw about GST and all the whole bunch of stuff. What it really means, I think, is if you look at historically, as a nation state, we would be much poorer, much less competitive, and much more closeted compared to the liberalization era. That's really what is going to happen. Well, what is the outcome of that? Things change. Sometimes 50 years, sometimes 20 years, sometimes 5 years. You don't know. Maybe when things change, and then maybe there is a bend back towards the arc. But that may probably take a while, and until then, you just have to endure. That's usually how I've seen most of the democracies manage it. Like, some never come back. Some come back with a lot of limping. Some come back faster. We don't know.
So I think related to that, in case we do manage to move forward, there's a question that asks, since you spoke of unfair advantage and information asymmetry, what would fair play and symmetrical access to information look like?
I think there should not be access to information by political parties. And that might be a harder one for the ECI to think about. But one thing they can definitely do is stop publishing polling booth data and use totalizer machines. People have talked about using totalizer machines. I mean, the unfortunate problem I see is our courts are usually the worst place to litigate any constitutional issue, particularly not just the Supreme Court, and particularly if it is technology. I think they just don't get it. So we have a larger problem in the way in which technology itself is understood in the country. Forget about governance. And I think if you're able to manage at least the totalizer problem by ensuring that at a polling booth level, the number is not published, I think that will go a long way towards removing the information asymmetry compared to what it is, at least towards the voters. Like, I'm pretty sure political parties would be pretty unhappy about it, but as voters, they would be a lot more happier.
Great, thank you. I don't think we have any more questions for you right now. Regarding the breakout room, I'm afraid we've had a bit of a technical difficulty, so we will keep you posted as soon as that's working. But do feel free to leave any more questions in the chat for any of the other speakers as well. Right. So the breakout room is now in progress. You should have received a message asking you to join the breakout room. Just to let you know, the breakout room session, in case you are, I think you're joining it, is going to be run by Riya Singh Sawhney and Pravita Kashyap of Rethink Aadhaar. And it's basically to discuss how one can resist the Aadhaar and the voter ID.
Albany.
Yes, hello. We haven't received a question from you.
No, I did not ask a question. I was supposedly a speaker.
Oh, I have
yes,
idea about this. Sorry.
Yes, Jagdeep ji, you're still speaking. You're scheduled to go live at 5:30, but if you want, we can also start at 5:15 since you're already here.
No, I have been here since 3. Am I supposed to go at 5:30?
Yes, sir, as per the schedule.
Oh.
As per the schedule, you are the next speaker. But since you're already here, we can start at 5:15 if you want. We had kept.
I've been here since about 3:30. So.
Yes, Jagdeep ji, we saw that. Thanks for joining us. So, should we start your talk at 5:15?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay, take. Thank you.
Right, we have a question for Usha if she's still here, and maybe we can address this before Jagdeep, thank you, comes on. So there's a question on please share your views on why written rules are not a requirement in compelling citizens in India. And I think this kind of relates to the question that was asked you earlier as well, as to what is it that kind of compels citizens. And like why aren't written rules kind of a requirement for these things to actually transpire?
If I understand the question, it is that it can actually be asked in 2 ways, if I've understood it right. One is, why are written rules not required for the government? And the other is, why is it that never mind what the rules, the government seems to have impunity in not following the rule and in breaking the rule just ignoring the rule. They don't break rules. The government never breaks rules. It just ignores it. And it says that it doesn't apply to it. Actually, there is one whole jurisprudential way of understanding this, which is about what rule of law means. And rule of law was also something that came to us through the colonial context, where there was a ruler and the ruler was trying to use various devices and various artifacts to try and get us where they wanted us. That's how they could have something like the Rowlatt Act. They could bring in sedition where it wasn't about the state not liking the people. It was about the people not liking the state, and that was an offense. So these are ways in which positive law and what they did with positive law. There's a whole thing on that. And up to a little while ago, say about liberalization kind of started diluting the idea of law, which is how you find, for instance, in the development sector, you'll find that they say we have, for those projects which are 1,000 crore and more, they will be exempt from the regular processes. It will just be a cabinet committee on investment which is going to deal with it, which completely shifts it to an executive domain. We've been watching this downslide for quite a while now. So it's not, in terms of the phenomenon, it's not new. But in terms of the extent to which this phenomenon has been taken, that is very new. And the way that has been done is also not just through the state not following the law, but the state assuming all manner of powers in its hands, the government assuming a lot of powers, and I should say the state, because the bureaucracy kind of goes beyond the government into the state. The way in which various, law is then made into a tool which the state can use when it finds, that it needs to control people. So if you look at all this kind of stuff that's coming now, where the UAPA, sedition, CA, many of these are things which have come alongside this technology. And it's very interesting to see how, if we look at who are the people who are pushing for this kind of technology use, it is people who claim to be libertarians, in the sense that, one of the agencies that went to court saying that this is a good project, and, they were there because they had to say that non-governmental and civil society groups also like this project, was CCS, which proclaims itself to be a libertarian institution. So state stay off. We don't want the state to come in, but they want the state to come in, just like it was with the market. They want the state to come in to use coercion on the people so that business can be free. It's in that kind of context. I mean, somebody has to be able to challenge this politically. It can't be, when Anand was talking about the courts and what they understand and what they don't. It's not only that. It's much more, because you need a body of opinion that will make the state hear. The farmers' resistance to the 3 laws is a classic case of a whole set of people saying this is not okay. And that's the kind of political voice that can override the kind of things that a state is saying that it has, which is to use the law on a people and to keep itself outside the law. So there is state exceptionalism and selective use of laws on a people. This is a kind of power that's being given to the state if the state can't be made to, if the state is not made to hear it otherwise, which is why I keep saying it's, we understand it, we need to get the parliamentarians to speak. Parliament is an extremely important place, which means that every person must know what their constituents are saying, but the constituents need to know what actually is troubling them. Today you have Tamil Nadu, which is actually a good government in many ways, which is making a solid effort to do what they can to put systems in place. But the imagination is of getting IIT to give them more and more databases. So, and it's through coercion there again. So it's and when World Bank introduced this idea in the early 90s, when they said we need good governance, which meant that the state has to be effective. It's not about being legal. It's not, you have something like the FATF, which has been brought in, which is a multilateral, kind of thing about managing monies, which comes in and says, okay, put FATF inside the UAP. So, we have to, I think we're not making the connections. And so we end up fighting small battles in different places. What happened in the early 2000s was that many of the battles that were being fought on the ground all got together. And that's what made for the change of whether it's an NREGA or RTI or the land question or the forest question. So the long answer to that short and good question, which shall now be shortly finished, is that it is part of a whole. It's part of a system. It's been on a sliding scale. And the pushback can only come from a people. And it has to be much more deliberated and much more clearly communicated and relentlessly communicated.
Thank you so much, Usha.
I'm sorry, these are political answers. These are not quick fixes, no?
No, I understand. Thank you very much. So we're going to actually move on to our next speaker, Jagdeep Chokar. Just a brief introduction. Mr. Chokar was a professor of management and organizational behavior at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. He is also a citizen activist for improving democracy and governance and the founder of Association for Democratic Reforms. Mr. Chokar will be speaking about analyzing electoral bonds. So the electoral bond scheme was first announced by the finance minister in India in his budget speech in Parliament on February the 1st, 2017. The heading of the section, which consisted of 2 paragraphs in the speech, was Transparency in Electoral Funding. The same afternoon, the finance minister said in a media interaction that, quote, "These bonds will be bearer in character to keep the donor anonymous." This is what started the doubts about the actual intention behind the scheme. Subsequent developments and disclosures, mostly using the RTI law, have confirmed that the actual intention behind introducing the scheme was not increasing transparency, but putting a curtain on whatever transparency existed. Some salient features of this scheme and their impact will be discussed during Mr. Chokar's talk.
Can I speak now?
Yes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chokar.
Thank you for that introduction. Electoral bonds have actually come to be the biggest innovation in political financing in India, for the simple reason that this has legalized giving unaccounted money to political parties. And although the heading of the finance minister's speech in the budget, while he presented the budget on 1st of February 2017, the title of the 2 paragraphs was Transparency in Electoral Funding. But what exactly the scheme did and how it has turned out to be has been the exact opposite of transparency, because the same day that he made the speech in the parliament, in the afternoon, the same finance minister in a media interaction said that the bond will be bearer in character to keep the donor anonymous. Since February 2, 2017, I have been looking for a dictionary which says that anonymity and transparency are synonyms of each other, and I have not yet found it. Now, after announcing the scheme in the budget, it was finally first when the budget papers were available in detail, and then finally when the notification of the scheme was done almost exactly a year later in February 2, 2018. When you read in between the lines, or actually when you read the lines, it turned out that it had done a variety of things. First of all, it amended 4 laws: the Representative People Act, the Income Tax Act, the Companies Act, and the Reserve Bank of India Act. Now, each of these, the amendments, if you look at them in some detail, you find that they are not for transparency, they are anti-transparency. For example, the Companies Act had a provision that no company or a company which has made profit for the last 3 years can donate not more than 7.5% of its profit to a political party or to any political party. Now, there was a limit for 7.5%. This limit of 7.5% was removed in that amendment of the Companies Act. In addition, the Companies Act also had a provision that every company had to disclose the name of the political party to which they had made donation and the amount of the donation. This requirement of disclosing the name of the company and the amount of the donation was also removed. So therefore, to say that this will achieve transparency is quite strange. At the same time, the removal of the 7.5% limit and a minor or a tweak to the FCRA around the same time, which changed the definition of a foreign source, made it possible for any foreign entity to set up a subsidiary in India and for the subsidiary to donate as much money as they want to any political party. Now, this opened the floodgates of unaccounted foreign money going into the Indian political system. Similarly, the other amendments to the Representation of People Act, Income Tax Act, etc., all they did was to close whatever little holes were there through which we could peep in and find out what the political parties are doing. In addition to this kind of thing, about 2 years later after that, through the Use of Right to Information Act, it turned out, it was learned that the Reserve Bank of India and the Election Commission of India had opposed this scheme in no uncertain terms. The Election Commission of India wrote a letter saying that electoral bonds in the way, shape and form that they are being introduced will encourage formation of shell companies to donate money to political parties, which obviously is not what anybody wanted. The RBI said that RBI is the only authority in the country to issue currency, and the electoral bonds are supposed to be like currency, because if somebody buys the electoral bond and gives it to a political party, or gives it to a person X buys a bond, gives it to Y, Y gives it to Z, Z gives it to Z, or Z gives it to X, etc. And then finally it lands with the political party. Within 15 days of purchase, it is valid. It is as good as currency. So the RBI had protested against this, but the objections of the RBI and the Election Commission of India were overruled by the Finance Ministry, and the kinds of notings that Finance Ministry officials made on the files are actually quite amusing, saying that the RBI does not seem to have understood what was the intention behind this. And the election commissioners were called, and they have understood and they have decided to withdraw their objections, whereas there has been no withdrawal of that. So against such objections by the by the constitutional authorities, the scheme was introduced. As soon as the scheme was introduced, several things came out. One was that it was said that it is completely anonymous. The bonds will not be identifiable or traceable in any way. A journalist from the Quint bought an electoral bond and put it through, forensic testing. And it was revealed that there was a unique alphanumeric number that the electoral bond held, which became visible only under ultraviolet light. So this contention that these were completely anonymous and they could not be traceable, could not be traced in any way, shape or form, was proved to be wrong. Number two, the provision was, or provision still is, that the State Bank of India is the only bank who is to sell these bonds through authorized branches during a 10-year or during a 10-day window every quarter in the year. So the government issued a notification, let's say from the 1st of January to the 10th of January, State Bank of India will sell these bonds through designated branches. Now, it also said that the State Bank of India will collect KYC or know your customer particulars, but will not share it with anyone at all unless somebody brings a court order. And therefore, the anonymity of the buyer will remain confidential. Now, to any observer of this kind of an activity, it is obvious that if State Bank of India, first of all, if State Bank of India was not to share this information with anybody at all, why would State Bank of India collect? Anyway, to say that State Bank of India will collect information and State Bank of India will not reveal this information to the Finance Ministry and the Finance Ministry will not release it to its minister is something that is not believable, at least to me, if not to anybody else. So it was, the mechanism turned out to be very simple, that if a person buys electoral bonds of any amount from the State Bank of India and heads or starts moving towards the office of a different political party than the ruling party. And the apprehension was that the State Bank of India's information about the buyer will go to the Finance Ministry and to the Finance Minister and to the party to which the Finance Minister belongs. It is independent of any party which is in power. So at the moment, the information goes that XYZ has bought these bonds and the person is headed to a different political party. It was speculated that a phone call will go to the person and he or she will be asked, so you have bought these bonds, where are you planning to donate them? Now, to a sensitive political party donator, this would be enough, and the person will then move toward the political party in power and donate all those bonds there. So the apprehension was that electoral bonds, the way they have been operationalized, through this information being available ostensibly only to the State Bank of India, had the potential of choking the funding for all opposition parties. Now, this was expressed as an apprehension in February 2018. And subsequently, when the data of the sales of electoral bonds for the first full year became available, because political parties had to declare it in their statement of income and expenditure, it was proved that 95% of the amount of bonds purchased in that year were donated to the political party in power. 215 crores worth of bonds were bought. 200 were donated to the political party in power. I think 10 crores were donated to the next biggest party, and 5 crores, strangely, were not encashed. And the scheme has a provision that if any bonds are not encashed within 15 days, that amount gets credited to the Prime Minister's Relief Fund. So in the first year, 95% of the funding through electoral bonds went to the ruling party. In the subsequent years, it has become a little less. It is somewhere around 70% or so. So 70% roughly of the funding through electoral bonds goes to the ruling party. Now, when ruling party has this monopoly of money, obviously the ruling party has the monopoly of contesting elections, or I should say winning the elections, because rightly or wrongly, money has started to play a huge part in the electoral process. Now, as soon as the scheme came to be known, the Association for Democratic Reforms, with whom I work, we filed a petition in the Supreme Court in August of 2017. There were many reasons. One of the main reasons was that the electoral bonds were introduced as a part of the budget. And the budget is a money bill. And a money bill's peculiarity is that the money bill is discussed in the Lok Sabha, and members make suggestions for modifications or amendments, etc. And then once the Lok Sabha has passed it, it goes to the Rajya Sabha. In the Rajya Sabha, the money bills are only discussed. The Rajya Sabha does not have the power to make any amendments to the bills. So effectively, if there is a majority in the Lok Sabha, then the government of the day can pass any bill they want, because if they have majority in the Lok Sabha, even if they are in minority in the Rajya Sabha cannot amend any of the money bills. Now, the definition of the money bill under the Constitution is that money bills by and large are those which deal with the expenditure and contributions to the Consolidated Fund of India. Now, the electoral bonds have nothing to do with the Consolidated Fund of India. Anybody, any citizen, any company can buy the bond from the State Bank of India and give it to a political party, which deposits it in a designated account. So Consolidated Fund of India has nothing to do with electoral bonds, and therefore legally electoral bonds do not qualify to be part of a money bill. And that makes the entire process constitutionally untenable. So the introduction of electoral bond scheme was unconstitutional. This was the first issue in our petition. And of course, there were many others, which I do not think I should list here. So the petition was filed in August 2017. It was heard, first hearing was held on October 3, 2017. And after that, it kind of seemed to go into a cold storage. Then we kept filing applications after another. But when the information about the Reserve Bank of India and the Election Commission of India opposing the scheme came out, then we filed another application in March of 2019. As a result of that application, a hearing was held on April 12. Actually, the hearing was held on April 10, 11, and 12. Now, on April 12, the Supreme Court bench headed by the Chief Justice wrote the following, and I quote, "All that we would like to state for the present is that the rival contentions give rise to weighty issues which have a tremendous bearing on the sanctity of the electoral process in the country." I would like to repeat this part of the sentence. Contentions give rise to weighty issues which have a tremendous bearing on the sanctity of the electoral process in the country. Such weighty issues would require an in-depth hearing which cannot be concluded and the issues answered within the limited time available, so and so. Now, April 12th, 2019, the petition raised weighty issues which had a tremendous bearing on the sanctity of the electoral process in the country. From 2019, April, we are now in, I think we are in 2022. 3 years have passed. The Supreme Court has not had time to consider these weighty issues, and the sale of electoral bonds has continued. Every time a new scheme is anticipated to be issued, we file an application for an urgent hearing, but we have, I think, filed about 5 or 6 applications by this time, but nothing has happened. Now, the Supreme Court seems to be in a slumber, or whatever I may say, There was a hearing subsequently, which were turned out to be very perfunctory, and the order that the bench issued, unfortunately, very clearly indicated that they had not understood what the issues were. So situation is that something like 8,000 to 9,000 crores of rupees have been given to political parties, primarily to the political party in power, and unaccounted money, foreign money from any source whatsoever continues to flow into political parties. And Indian democracy very soon, I don't know even if it must have been done even now, will be controlled by money, the source of which will not be known. Now, this is not a very happy or a healthy prospect for any democracy. But the other parties, yes, one political party has filed a petition in the Supreme Court with us, but all other political parties pay lip service to opposing the scheme, but they also are kind of hopeful that when their turn comes, they will also be able to get some donations, and therefore they are ambivalent about these bonds. This is very unfortunate. The control of money from any source on political system of the country is now legal, and that I don't think I need to say anymore. I have finished. Thank you very much. Any questions? I'll be trying to answer them.
Thank you, Mr. Chokra. Yes, I think there is a question. What reforms does political financing require? Would state funding elections help?
State funding elections is a very interesting phenomenon which has been talked about for a very long time. The first misunderstanding here is the word state funding. When we say the state will fund elections, the question to be asked is, where does the state get money from? And on very, very quick reflection, we would realize that it is the money that it gets from citizens by way of taxes, etc., etc. So I have argued for the last 3-4 years, and now some people have come to accept this, that this should be called public funding of elections. While this may seem to be just a semantic change, but there are any number of examples where in India, unfortunately, the phenomenon seems to be that anything which is governmental is free. In an election of the municipal corporation, there was a meeting of candidates, kind of a public meeting with candidates of all political parties, and each candidate was asked, what will you do? And one candidate said, because this was in a kind of a slum area where there were unauthorized colonies, one candidate said that our leader has given us the slogan, "Jo zameen sarkari hai, wo zameen hamari hai." So anything which is governmental is considered to be free. Therefore, if we call it state funding, the common person in the street does not get disturbed by it. But if we call it public funding, then I think people's view would be slightly different. Anyway, this is one issue. The difficult, well, technically or philosophically, it is perfectly all right. Because people are supposed to contest elections for doing public service. Therefore, they should not spend their own money, they should spend public money. That's perfectly fine. But the question, there are two issues here. If we decide that from next year, we will have public funding of elections. Now, one thing that we would need to do is to set out a budget. How much money should be provided for the state funding of elections? Now, in the government and in most other places that I know, it is based on estimates. And one source of estimate is what did we spend on it last time? And then you add some, 10%, 15%, 50%, 200%. But you need the figure of how much did we spend on this? So that would require political parties and candidates to reveal how much did they actually spend. Now, then there is an argument that candidates are required to give election expenditure affidavits. And they can tell us how much they spent. Now, I can tell you that in the 2009 Lok Sabha election, we analyzed the election expenditure affidavits of 6,753 candidates. At that time, the limit was, I think, about 15 or 16 lakhs. Only 4 candidates out of 6,573 said that they had exceeded the limit. Only 4. 30 candidates said that they had spent about 90% of the limit. So 6,753 minus 34 is 6,719. They said that they had spent between 45 to 55% of the limit. And Chief Election Commissioner at that time said that if this is the case, we should reduce this limit and not increase it every time. The point of sharing this actual data is that every candidate lies when they give these election expenditure affidavits. Lying is a non-parliamentary word. I suppose parliamentary word is the underreport. And there is no limit on the expenditure of political parties. So how will we operationalize public funding is a problem that I am not able to solve. The other issue is that if public funding is given to political parties and candidates for fighting elections, it stands to reason that they should not accept any other money. If they will take public funding and also continue to take other funding, then the whole purpose is lost and it becomes like throwing good money after bad money. It's like telling a government employee who is in the habit of taking bribes that you will increase your salary 5 times to stop taking bribes. Unlikely to happen. So state public funding is a very good idea, but it is in the current situation not practical. The only way to control election expenditure is, there are 2 ways of controlling it. One is that political parties have to become democratic in their internal functioning, including choosing their candidates. Today, choosing the candidates is the greatest mystery on earth. Why they are chosen apparently for something called winnability. What winnability is, nobody seems to know. So that is where a lot of money changes hands. And the other is that political parties have to be transparent in their financial affairs. Political parties claim that they deal with public issues and they work for the public. But therefore, if they do that, then they should also be willing to share information about how much money do they get, whom do they get it from, how do they spend it, and how much do they spend. But as I said, the electoral bonds are now the gold standard for opacity of political funding. Therefore, we are not moving in the right direction at all. This is all I can say in answer to this question.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question in the chat, which is, how did corporate funding to political parties work before electoral bonds were introduced?
That worked very well. The law was that any donation that a political party received, which was more than 20,000 rupees, would have to be disclosed in a statement of donations. So the political party, it worked this way, that either corporates gave 19,999 checks about 200, 400 times, or They gave whatever they wanted in cash. It is a personal experience of mine that I was on a television debate with a politician and a corporate person. The politician said, we want to take money through check, but the corporate sector does not want to give it by check. The corporate person said, we want to give it by check, but they don't want to take it by check. Now, after I experienced that, I had to think about how could that be reconciled. And then after some thought, it occurred to me that the reason is that if the money donations are made by check, then the amounts are clear and laid down. If it is through cash, let us say I am a politician, which I know, I think I would say I'm a corporate sector person and you are a politician. And we meet and you say, I need 10 crores of rupees. And I said, Acha, we'll send it to you. And I send my person with 10,000 crores of cash. This person does not meet you personally, but he or she gives it to one of your assistants. And the person says that, Sethji has given me only 9 crores. So the political party person will take 9 crores and tell his or her boss that Sethji has sent only 8 crores. So there is a question of, or there is a personal interest. And this is part of the reason, or this may be part of the reason why every election we see that the wealth or assets of politicians increase 200 times, 500 times, 6,000 times. Where does that come from? Possibly this is the source, and it suits both sides. There is a corporate sector and political sector nexus, and it worked that way, but this has now legalized it. Earlier, there was some kind of, I suppose, shame is a very strong word, but some kind of embarrassment. But now there is nothing, it is perfectly above board.
Right. And just one last question. Is there a precedent of this kind of electoral funding elsewhere in the world? And what kind of implications have we seen occurring elsewhere when electoral bonds have been put in place?
See, political funding all over the world is murky. There is no denying that. And in some countries, which I don't want to name, it is even worse than us. But the question is, and in those countries where it is a little better than us, there are better disclosure norms and there is better enforcement of the laws. Here, unfortunately, we are making laws in the guise of providing transparency and creating complete opacity. So the question is, political parties and I must say the corporate sector, they are not interested in transparency. It serves their selfish, partisan, short-term interests, and they are not willing to look at long-term national interests, unfortunately.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Joker. We'll now move on to our next speaker. So our next speaker will be speaking, I think, in a few more minutes. We're just waiting for people to return from the breakout rooms as well. Right. So our next speaker is SQ Misuse, who is a social activist who uses advocacy and legal interventions to ensure better implementation of welfare schemes. He is a practitioner of RTI since 2007 and the secretary of ASIM, an NGO. So today he'll be speaking about the introduction of facial recognition for electoral roll verification in Hyderabad. Please note that this talk will be in Hindi. So the issue of deletion of names from the voters list is not new. Before almost every election, it is found that lakhs of voters are deleted by the Election Commission, who then claim that this exercise was done as there were duplicate or multiple voters, and it is only these who have been removed. But the problem is bigger and more nuanced, which the Election Commission has failed to address for years. Besides deletion of names from voters lists, it is found that there are common areas which are yet to be addressed, that is entering incorrect names, age, address, and missing or wrong photographs, which have been uploaded in the Election Commission's EPIC database. Mr. Masood's team has found that authorities delete names of voters randomly and likely on account of pressure from higher officials who perhaps have to show that they have reduced the number of voters within a particular constituency or ward. This happens largely without following any due procedure or without set parameters and undertaking such an exercise. Mr. Masood, please proceed. Thank you.
थैंक यू पद्मनी जी। वैसे तो आपने बहुत ही ब्रीफ में सारी चीजें बताई हैं, तो मैं कोशिश करूंगा कि बहुत कम टाइम में अपनी बात को रखूं। जो वोटर लिस्ट का जो इशू है, मैं वहां से शुरू करूंगा कि वोटर लिस्ट हमारे मुल्क में जो है आमतौर पे कभी बेहतर कंडीशन में आ नहीं सकी। इलेक्टोरल रोल जो है उसकी वजह यह है कि देयर आर डिफरेंट काइंड ऑफ एरर्स वी फाउंड इन द वोटर लिस्ट, लाइक नाम गलत है वोटर्स का, उनकी जो फोटोग्राफ होती है बिल्कुल बहुत खराब कंडीशन में होती है। कई बार ऐसा होता है किसी और की फोटोग्राफ को हम किसी के साथ जोड़ देते हैं, तो किसी की एज में प्रॉब्लम होती है, किसी के एड्रेस में प्रॉब्लम होती है। तो दिस काइंड ऑफ इश्यूज वी यूज्ड टू सी इन द वोटर लिस्ट रेगुलरली। इसके अलावा जो बड़ा इशू हम देखते हैं वो है डिलीशन ऑफ वोटर्स। वो डिलीशन ऑफ वोटर्स जो होते हैं वो आमतौर पे जो इलेक्शन कमीशन कहता है कि क्यों कर रहे हैं, तो वो बताते हैं कि हम प्यूरिफिकेशन ऑफ वोटर लिस्ट के लिए कर रहे हैं। डिडुप्लीकेशन प्रोसेस है ये, जिसमें हम बोकस जो वोटर्स होते हैं या डुप्लीकेट वोटर्स होते हैं या ऐसा वोटर जिसके मल्टीपल एंट्रीज हैं उसको हम डिलीट कर देते हैं। तो बोगस या मल्टीपल एंट्रीज जो होते हैं वोटर्स के, वो किस तरीके से होते हैं? वो ये होता है कि एक गरीब आदमी जो किराए के मकान में होता है आमतौर पे, वो आज किसी एक एरिया में रहता है और वो एक साल के बाद कोई और दूसरे एरिया में शिफ्ट हो जाता है। तो उसका जो एनरोलमेंट होता है वोटर लिस्ट में, उसको आईडी प्रूफ चाहिए होता है एड्रेस का, तो ही यूज्ड टू एनरोल फ्रॉम दैट प्लेस एज वेल। तो मल्टीपल प्लेसेस से उसका एंट्री उसमें होता है इलेक्टोरल रोल्स में, वोटर्स डेटा में। तो उसको प्यूरिफिकेशन करने के लिए, उसको डिलीट करने के लिए इलेक्शन कमीशन ये इसका डिडुप्लीकेशन करता है। और ये कई बार हमने देखा है, जब से मैं एज वोटर इनरोल हुआ हूँ तब से हम देख रहे हैं कि ये इस तरीके के इश्यूज हैं। हर इलेक्शन से पहले जो वोटर लिस्ट, फाइनल वोटर लिस्ट आती है, उसमें कई लोगों के नाम होते नहीं है। लोग पोलिंग बूथ पे आते हैं पुराना अपना वोटर आईडी कार्ड लेकर, लेकिन उनका नाम वोटर लिस्ट में होता नहीं है। इस तरीके के इश्यूज होते हैं। तो क्यों जो जेन्युइन वोटर्स होते हैं उनके नाम डिलीट होते हैं? जब इलेक्शन कमीशन कहता है कि हम डुप्लीकेट या बोगस या फिर मल्टीपल एंट्रीज जो है उन्हीं को डिलीट करें, लेकिन जो डिलीट होते हैं उसमें मेजॉरिटी जो होते हैं जेन्युइन वोटर्स होते हैं। तो उसकी वजह यह है कि जो प्रोसेस है रिप्रेजेंटेशन ऑफ पीपल्स एक्ट में, जो रोल्स एंड रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटीज हैं ब्लॉक बूथ लेवल ऑफिसर्स और इलेक्टोरल रजिस्ट्रेशन ऑफिसर्स के, वो कहीं ना कहीं अपनी ड्यूटीज को परफॉर्म करने में फेल होते हैं। जो बूथ लेवल ऑफिसर होता है उसकी रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी होती है कि वो एंट्रीज करें वोटर लिस्ट में, लोगों के नाम ऐड करें, वो वेरीफाई करें डुप्लीकेट वोटर्स को, उनका नाम रिजेक्ट करें, उनको नोटिस दें बिफोर डिलीशन, या फिर अगर डिलीट करते हैं तो उसके बाद उनको रीजन बताएं कि क्यों डिलीट किया गया। ये सारा प्रोसेस देयर इज अ प्रोसेस विच शुड बी फॉलोड, लेकिन वो होता नहीं है। उसके नहीं होने की वजूहत में कई चीजें हैं। एक वजह जो मुझे समझ में आती है वो ये है कि जितने इलेक्शन ड्यूटीज पे ऑफिसर्स होते हैं, इंक्लूडिंग बीएलओ और ईआरओ इलेक्टोरल रजिस्ट्रेशन ऑफिसर, ये सारे डिप्यूटेशन बेसिस पे होते हैं। ये या तो म्युनिसिपल कॉर्पोरेशन के एम्प्लॉइज होते हैं, या फिर गवर्नमेंट टीचर्स होते हैं, या फिर आंगनवाड़ी वर्कर्स होते हैं, और डिप्यूटेशन बेसिस पे होते हैं। और इनको जो हॉनरेरियम दिया जाता है इनकी ड्यूटी परफॉर्म करने का, वो पर एनम 3,000 to 5,000 रुपीज दिया जाता है। यानी इतना एक क्रूशल काम उनको दिया जाए, इतना इंपॉर्टेंट रोल दिया जा रहा है। और जहाँ पे ये कहा जा रहा है कि बीएलओ इज द रिप्रेजेंटेटिव ऑफ इलेक्शन कमीशन ऑन द ग्राउंड, तो उसके साथ जिस तरीके का वो है कि हम उसको पे नहीं करते हैं बराबर, या उसका फुल चार्ज किसी को हम नहीं दे पाते हैं, टेम्पररी बेसिस पे हम आंगनवाड़ी टीचर को बोल देते हैं या गवर्नमेंट टीचर को बोल देते हैं कि आप इसका वेरिफिकेशन करिए, डोर टू डोर वेरिफिकेशन करिए, वो होता नहीं है। तो उसकी वजह ये होती है कि इलेक्शन कमीशन के ऊपर प्रेशर आता है हर इलेक्शन से पहले कि एक स्पेसिफिक कॉन्स्टिट्यूंसी में जहाँ पे 1 लाख वोटर होने चाहिए थे, पॉलिटिकल पार्टीज को पता चलता है कि 1,20,000 या 1,30,000 वोटर्स हैं, तो वो कहते हैं कि इसमें बोगस वोटर्स हैं, तो इलेक्शन में बोगसिंग होगी, रिगिंग होगी, तो आप इमीडिएट इसको ठीक करिए। इलेक्शन कमीशन पॉलिटिकल पार्टीज के प्रेशर में आके रैंडमली वोटर्स के नाम डिलीट कर देता है। रैंडमली जिनका अपडेशन हुआ है, जिन्होंने नया एनरोल किया है पिछले 2-3 साल में, इस तरीके के नाम को वो लोग इमीडिएट डिलीट कर देते हैं ताकि ये बता सकेंगे हाँ हमने ये प्रोसेस किया है और हमने 20,000 नामों को डिलीट किया है। बट देयर इज नो प्रूफ के जिनको डिलीट किया है वो जेन्युइन थे या फिर बोगस थे। ये एक है। तो इन चीजों पे जहाँ पे इलेक्शन कमीशन को चाहिए था कि उनका जो मैकेनिज्म, जो इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर है उसको स्ट्रेंथन करें, लाइक बूथ लेवल ऑफिसर्स को जो ना प्रॉपरली अपॉइंट करें, उनको अच्छी खासी उनकी उनको पैसा दें उनके काम के लिए, वो नहीं हो पाता है। लेकिन इलेक्शन कमीशन क्या करता है कि एक दूसरे वाले सॉल्यूशन लेके आते हैं, टेक्नोलॉजी बेस्ड सॉल्यूशन, जिसको हम आमतौर पर डिस्कस कर रहे हैं बहुत देर से। तेलंगाना में 2016, 17, 18 में आधार और वोटर आईडी का लिंक शुरू हुआ था वॉलंटरीली। उसमें 2-3 अलग अलग ऑप्शन दिए गए थे। घर पे आके ऑफिसर्स पूछते थे आपको लिंक करना है तो आप अपना मोबाइल नंबर, वोटर आईडी कार्ड या आधार नंबर दे दें तो दे विल लिंक दिस, या फिर आप SMS कर दें, ये नंबर्स को मिला के तो हो जाएगा। तो ऐसे 2-3 ऑप्शंस उन्होंने दिए थे जिसमें कई लोगों ने आधार लिंक किया। 2018 इलेक्शन से पहले there are several reports कि around 20 to 30 lakh voter names have been deleted from the voter list. उसमें कई सीनियर IPS IAS ऑफिसर्स के भी नाम डिलीट हुए हैं तेलंगाना से। अगर पर्टिकुलरली मैं अगर अपने केस की बात करूं तो मेरे फैमिली मेंबर्स ने किसी ने मेरा वोटर आईडी और आधार लिंक करने का फॉर्म फिलअप कर दिया था घर पे जब ऑफिसर्स आए थे। तो हुआ ये कि मेरा जो वोटर आईडी था वो मेरे पुराने एड्रेस पे था और मेरा आधार कार्ड जो था पुराने एड्रेस पे था और मेरा वोटर आईडी नए एड्रेस पे था, नए घर पे जहाँ पे हूँ मैं। तो आधार में इंफॉर्मेशन अलग थी, वोटर आईडी कार्ड में मेरी इंफॉर्मेशन अलग थी, और मेरा वोटर आईडी कार्ड जो है उसमें फोटो, उसमें प्रॉपर डेट ऑफ बर्थ और सारी चीजें मैंने ऐड की थी जो मेरे पास वोटर आईडी कार्ड में अभी भी है। लेकिन जब इलेक्शन के टाइम पे जब मेरा वोटर स्लिप आया उसमें सारी इंफॉर्मेशन जो थी मेरी पुराने एड्रेस से थी, और पुराना वाला फोटो, पुराना एड्रेस, सारी पुरानी डिटेल जिसको मैंने अपडेट किया था वो सारी चीजें। इट मीन्स के जो अपडेटेड इन्फॉर्मेशन मैंने की थी इलेक्टोरल में वो सारी डिटेल डिलीट कर दी गई। और मुझे मेरा ये मानना है कि जो आधार की जो इन्फॉर्मेशन मेरी है पुराने एड्रेस पे पुरानी डिटेल्स जो उसको उसने समझा कि ये एक्यूरेट है, ये सही है, तो उसको उन्होंने चेंज कर दिया उससे। तो ठीक है, लेकिन अगर वोटर आईडी और आधार से लिंक करने में ये दिक्कत होगी कि हमको हर बार अपने एड्रेस को या अपने डिटेल्स को अपडेट करना पड़ेगा, तो दिस कैन बी ए बिग चैलेंज, क्योंकि गरीब लोग जो हैं नहीं कर सकेंगे। और आधार रूल्स में और सर्कुलर्स जो इशू किए हैं UIDAI ने, उसमें कई जगहों पे इसका जिक्र किया गया कि आप एड्रेस, नेम या दूसरे जो डिटेल्स हैं आपकी 2 या 3 बार अपनी लाइफ में अपडेट कर पाएंगे। तो इसको भी हमको सीरियसली देखना पड़ेगा। एक दूसरा जो केस था जिसमें फेशियल रिकग्निशन का फॉर वेरिफिकेशन ऑफ वोटर्स के लिए तेलंगाना गवर्नमेंट ने एक एक्सपेरिमेंट किया है। तेलंगाना में कोमपल्ली एक म्यूनसिपालिटी है, वहाँ पे म्यूनसिपल इलेक्शन में 10 पोलिंग बूथ पे गवर्नमेंट ऑफ तेलंगाना ने प्रपोज किया था तेलंगाना स्टेट टेक्नोलॉजिकल सर्विसेज। ये एक एजेंसी है गवर्नमेंट ऑफ तेलंगाना की जो सारे डेटाबेस को मैनेज करती है, या फिर आप ऐसा बोलें कि ये तेलंगाना का खुद का अपना एक UIDAI जैसा एक ऑर्गेनाइजेशन है जो सारे डेटाबेस मेंटेन करता है। उसने प्रपोजल दिया इलेक्शन कमीशन को कि हम एक्सपेरिमेंट करना चाह रहे हैं फेशियल रिकग्निशन का, यानी जो वोटर आएगा पोलिंग बूथ पे उसको वोट डालने से पहले उसको वेरीफाई किया जाएगा। उसके लिए इलेक्शन कमीशन ने अपने वोटर डिटेल्स जो हैं वो TS को शेयर किए 10 पोलिंग बूथ का। वहाँ पे उनके TS के ऑफिसर्स को डिप्यूट किया गया, वो लोग जो वोटर्स थे उनके फोटोग्राफ्स ले रहे थे, अपडेट कर रहे थे, और उनको अलाउ कर रहे थे वेरिफिकेशन के बाद वोट डालने के लिए। तो ये 2020 में हुआ। इसमें जो इनका जो सक्सेस रेट रहा या करेक्टली आइडेंटिफाई जो परसेंटेज रहा है 10 पोलिंग बूथ में, उसमें 63 to 85 के बीच में इनका सक्सेस रेट रहा टू आइडेंटिफाई द वोटर। इसमें दिक्कत ये है कि अगर फेशियल रिकग्निशन को अगर तेलंगाना गवर्नमेंट समझ रही है कि हम इसको यूज करेंगे टू आइडेंटिफाई द करेक्ट वोटर और डुप्लीकेट या बोगस वोट ना पड़े उसके लिए, तो इसमें सबसे बड़ी दिक्कत ये हुई कि आपको पहले अपना वोटर लिस्ट सही करना पड़ेगा। जैसे मैं बोल रहा था कि वोटर लिस्ट में सबसे इंपॉर्टेंट चीज होती है वो है फोटोग्राफ वोटर की, जो मेजॉरिटी लोगों के फोटोग्राफ्स आज भी ठीक नहीं है वोटर लिस्ट में। अगर जिन्होंने करेक्ट करवाए हैं, जैसे कि मैंने करवाया था, तो उसको भी उन्होंने डिलीट कर दिया है, और पुराना वाला फोटो जो शायद मेरे आज के चेहरे से मैच ना करे वो उसमें है। और ब्लैक एंड व्हाइट फोटोग्राफ्स हमारे आमतौर पे ये लोग पब्लिक डोमेन में डालते हैं, लेकिन टीएस को उन्होंने कलर फोटोग्राफ्स शेयर किए थे। तो ये था। और जो लो परसेंटेज ऑफ वेरिफिकेशन इनका था जिस पुलिस बूथ पे, पोलिंग बूथ पे, उसकी वजह इन्होंने बताई कि वहाँ पे इंटरनेट कनेक्टिविटी का इशू था। ऑफ कोर्स होगा, क्योंकि हम जिस सोसाइटी में रहते हैं, हमारी जो सोसाइटी है यहाँ पे, हमारे पास इलिटरेसी ज़्यादा है, हमारे पास गरीबी ज़्यादा है, हमारे पास लोग भूख से मरते हैं। तो हम ये समझेंगे कि हम यूएस या यूके में जो फार्मूला काम में आता है, जो टेक्नोलॉजी यूज में आती है, वो सेम चीज़ हम यहाँ पे इम्प्लीमेंट करेंगे, वो नहीं होने वाली है। आप शहरों को अगर जहन में रख के अगर कोई पॉलिसी बनाते हैं, तो वो शायद हमारे मुल्क के लिए काम में ना आए। तो एक तो इंटरनेट का प्रॉब्लम उन्होंने बताया कुछ पोलिंग बूथ पे, और कुछ जगहों पे लाइटनिंग का इशू बताया, जहाँ पे अंधेरा था या लाइट प्रॉपर नहीं थी, उनको वहाँ पे वेरिफिकेशन बराबर नहीं हो पाया। पर वी डोंट नो एग्जैक्टली कि कितने लोगों को उन्होंने चेक किया था और कितने लोगों का किस वजह से जो है उनका वेरिफिकेशन नहीं हो पाया फेशियल रिकग्निशन का। जो ऐप इन्होंने यूज किया है फेशियल रिकग्निशन के लिए वोटर्स का, वो डेवलप किया गया है तेलंगाना स्टेट टेक्नोलॉजिकल सर्विसेज में। ये ऐप सबसे पहले डेवलप किया गया था जो पेंशनर्स होते हैं गवर्नमेंट के, उनका वेरिफिकेशन करने के लिए। साल में एक बार हर पेंशनर को अपना लाइफ सर्टिफिकेट देना पड़ता है, कि उसको हयातनामा बोलते हैं हम लोग, उसको सबमिट करना पड़ता है। पहले ये होता था कि हम जाते थे गजेट ऑफिसर के सामने, पेंशनर को खड़ा करते थे, वो वेरीफाई करता था कि हाँ ये जिंदा है, तो इनको पेंशन कंटिन्यू करनी चाहिए। उसको इन लोगों ने डिजिटाइज किया करके, सारा जो वोटर्स का डेटाबेस इनके पास था, जो पहले लीक हुआ है, पहले हमारे स्पीकर ने भी कहा है कि तेलंगाना में यूनाइटेड आंध्र प्रदेश में वोटर्स का जो डेटाबेस है कलर फोटोग्राफ्स के साथ, वो लीक हुआ था। तो उसको, वो डेटाबेस तेलंगाना स्टेट टेक्नोलॉजिकल सर्विसेज आज भी यूज कर रही है। वोटर्स का डेटाबेस उन्होंने उस ऐप में डाला, पेंशनर वेरिफिकेशन के लिए जो बनाया था, उसमें वोटर्स की डिटेल्स और जो प्रेजेंट पेंशनर है उसकी आज की डिटेल्स, उसको वो लोग मैच कर रहे थे। तो उनका मानना ये है कि बहुत से केसेस में उनको सक्सेस रेट मिला है पेंशनर्स को वेरीफाई करने के लिए। तो उन्होंने ये प्रपोज किया कि हम पेंशनर्स के लिए ये कर रहे हैं, तो हम टेस्ट करना चाह रहे हैं कि वोटर्स के लिए भी ये किया जाए। तो इसमें एक तो ये है कि जो डेटा इलेक्शन कमीशन ने शेयर किया है टीएस को, उसकी रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी कौन लेगा। इलेक्शन कमीशन ने कलर फोटोग्राफ्स उनको दिए हैं, डेमोग्राफिक इन्फॉर्मेशन उनको दिए हैं, और आरटीआई जो मैंने फाइल किया था जिसमें ये सारी डिटेल्स टीएस ने बताई है, उन्होंने कहा है कि हमने अपने सर्वर से सारी डिटेल्स डिलीट कर दी हैं, सारा डेटाबेस डिलीट कर दिया, फोटोग्राफ सारी चीजें, बट वी डोंट नो उन्होंने डिलीट किया है या नहीं किया है। उसी तरीके से तेलंगाना में जो दूसरे जो प्रोग्राम चल रहे थे डिजिटाइजेशन के, जिसपे मेरा थोड़ा सा तजुर्बा है, जिसमें राशनिंग का एक केस है और पेंशन वेरिफिकेशन का मैंने तो आपको बताया ही है। अब दिक्कत ये कि अगर वोटर्स वेरिफिकेशन के लिए आप फेशियल रिकग्निशन या फिर आधार का यूज करेंगे, तो इसमें जो आधार में जो पहले प्रॉब्लम हमको आए थे, वो प्रॉब्लम हमको आगे भी आने वाले हैं। अगेन फेशियल रिकग्निशन टेक्नोलॉजी आप यूज करें, उसकी एक्यूरेसी कितनी होगी उस पर डिपेंड करता है, आपका लोकेशन जो होगा उस पर डिपेंड करता है, और इंटरनेट की कनेक्टिविटी कहाँ पे होगी उस पर डिपेंड करता है। और अगर मैं अगर जा रहा हूँ और एक ऑफिसर मेरी फोटोग्राफ ले रहा है, लेके बिना मैच किए डेटाबेस है, और कह रहा है कि नहीं आपका वोट यहाँ पे नहीं है, तो मैं वोट नहीं डाल पाऊंगा, क्योंकि वो जो है वो वोटर वेरिफिकेशन की जो रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी दी है वो ऑफिसर को दी है, जिसके पास फोन होगा। अगर वो ऐप में सर्च ना भी करें, सिर्फ ऐसा बता दें कि मैंने फोटो लिया है, तो लोग मानेंगे कि हाँ इनके पास डेटा बेस में नहीं है, तो हमको कहीं और जाना पड़ेगा, लोग वोट नहीं करेंगे, चले जाएंगे। जैसे वोटर्स का नाम डिलीट होता है, तो लोग पोलिंग बूथ के चक्कर काट के घर जाके बैठ जाते हैं, जिसकी वजह से पोलिंग परसेंटेज बहुत घटता है। पोलिंग में पोलिंग परसेंटेज इसलिए नहीं घटता है कि लोग वोट देने के लिए नहीं आते, पोलिंग परसेंटेज इसलिए घटता है कि लोगों को इन्फॉर्मेशन बराबर नहीं मिलती है, और उनका पोलिंग बूथ जो होता है वहाँ पे उनका नाम नहीं होता है, या उनका नाम उनके होता है तो इनके आईडी कार्ड में वो सारी चीज़ें मैच नहीं कर पाती। ये सब चीज़ें हैं। फेशियल रिकग्निशन के यूज में एक दिक्कत जो आ सकती है वो है औरतों के साथ, मैं जब कम्युनिटी में लोगों से मिलता हूँ, तो मैंने जब डिस्कस किया कि इस तरीके की टेक्नोलॉजी आ रही है, तो आपको वोट देना पड़ेगा आगे चल के, तो आपकी फोटोग्राफ ली जाएगी। तो औरतों की तरफ से ज्यादा रेसिस्टेंस आ रहा था। लोग बोल रहे थे कि नहीं, हम क्यों फोटो हमारी दे, ऑलरेडी हमने फोटो दे दिया है, गवर्नमेंट के पास डेटाबेस है, गवर्नमेंट के पास सारी डिटेल्स हमारी हैं, फोटो हमने दिया है, उसको स्कैन किया है हमारे आईडी कार्ड पे, लेकिन फिर हम दूसरी फोटो क्यों दें उनको। तो ये चीजें हो सकती है। फिर अगर हम रूरल एरियाज की बात करें, तो वहाँ पे इस टेक्नोलॉजी का यूज करना बहुत ही चैलेंजिंग होगा। ट्राइबल कम्युनिटी के साथ मुश्किल हो जाएगा, मुस्लिम कम्युनिटी के साथ ट्रेडिशनली जाके फोटोग्राफ्स उतरवाना करवाना, ये सारी चीजें थोड़ा सा दिक्कत होती है। आम लोगों में जो इलिटरेट लोग होते हैं, वो लोग उसको ज्यादा तरजीह नहीं देते हैं। इस तरीके के इश्यूज आएंगे। एक और जो एक्सपेरिमेंट रिसेंटली लास्ट ईयर तेलंगाना गवर्नमेंट ने किया है, वो था ई वोटिंग। ई वोटिंग में ये था कि जो इंफॉर्मेशन इनके पास है, जो लोग वॉलंटरी इसमें एक्सपेरिमेंट में पार्टिसिपेट करना चाहे, उनको एक्सेस दिया गया एक ऐप का, जिसको डाउनलोड करेंगे और वो लोग सेल्फी लेंगे। सेल्फी लेके उनको ऑथेंटिकेशन करना पड़ेगा कि ये आदमी है, तो उनके डेटाबेस के साथ लिंक करेंगे, तो वहां से रिमोटली ही कैन वोट, अपना वोट दे सकेगा। तो इस तरीके की टेक्नोलॉजी, इस तरीके के जो रास्ते गवर्नमेंट निकाल रही है, ये जबकि गवर्नमेंट के पास सारा इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर है, सारे प्रोसेसेस हैं, उसको स्ट्रेंथन करने की बजाय टेक्नोलॉजी बेस्ड सोल्यूशन, वो भी इंटरनेट बेस्ड, उतना आसान नहीं होगा, लोगों को परेशानियां होगी। और इस तरीके की टेक्नोलॉजी बेस्ड जो सोल्यूशन गवर्नमेंट निकाल रही है, ये बहुत ही आर्बिट्ररी पावर्स देती है स्टेट को विदाउट एनी अकाउंटेबिलिटी। जैसा मैं एक केस यहाँ पे डील कर रहा हूँ, वो है डिलीशन ऑफ राशन कार्ड्स का। तेलंगाना गवर्नमेंट ने पिछले 6 साल में 20 लाख राशन कार्ड्स डिलीट किए हैं, बिना बेनिफिशियरीज को बताया कि क्यों उन्होंने किए हैं। ये सारा प्रोसेस डिजिटाइज किया गया है, एक सिस्टम डेवलप किया गया जिसमें वोटर्स का डेटा, वोटर लिस्ट का इंफॉर्मेशन, आधार की इंफॉर्मेशन, नेशनल पॉपुलेशन रजिस्टर की इंफॉर्मेशन, रोड ट्रांसपोर्ट अथॉरिटी जो होता है उसके पास से इंफॉर्मेशन, सारी इंफॉर्मेशन लेके इन्होंने इनकॉर्पोरेट की है एक सॉफ्टवेयर में, और सॉफ्टवेयर को कुछ कोडिंग इन्होंने दी है जिसपे सॉफ्टवेयर एनालिसिस करेगा और बताएगा कि ये कैटेगरी में आप लोगों को जो है ना डिलीट करेंगे। तो जो कंप्यूटर जनरेटेड रिजल्ट है, उसमें उसको बिना वेरीफाई किए फील्ड में उन्होंने रिजेक्ट कर दिए 20 लाख राशन कार्ड। उसका केस तेलंगाना हाई कोर्ट में हमने फाइल किया था, PIL अभी सुप्रीम कोर्ट में पेंडिंग है। इसी तरीके का जो टेक्नोलॉजी बेस्ड सोल्यूशन जो होते हैं, ये आर्बिट्ररी पावर्स देते हैं विदाउट एनी अकाउंटेबिलिटी। अगर अब हम जाके ERO से पूछें कि मेरा वोटर ID कार्ड किस वजह से रिजेक्ट हुआ है, तो वो जवाब नहीं दे पाएगा। ही विल से कि जनाब नहीं, हमको पता नहीं, क्योंकि एक कंप्यूटर पे हुआ है, कंप्यूटर बेस्ड हुआ है, तो हमको इस चीज की पता नहीं। तो ये सारी चीजें हम लोग चैलेंजेस फेस कर रहे हैं, आगे भी फेस करेंगे। ये सारी चीजें हमको, जब तक हम डोर टू डोर वेरिफिकेशन का इंतजाम नहीं करेंगे वोटर लिस्ट का, या वोटर लिस्ट को सुधारना है तो हमको डोर टू डोर वेरिफिकेशन करना पड़ेगा। इसके लिए हमको जो अवेलेबल मैकेनिज्म है उसको स्ट्रेंथन करना पड़ेगा। तो आई थिंक इसी के साथ मैं अपनी बात को खत्म करूंगा। I am very thankful to the OneVote project and Article 21 Trust for giving this opportunity. Thank you.
Many thanks, Mr. Masood. I think we have a question from Madhvi. Thanks.
Hi.
From Madhvi, sorry.
हाँ जी, थैंक यू सो मच मसूद, आपका बहुत इंटरेस्टिंग था आपका सेशन, एंड स्पेशली जो सारा एक्सपीरियंस आपने शेयर किया। मैं ये क्वेश्चन आपसे पूछना चाहती थी कि जिन लोगों के नाम वोटर रोल से हटे, जो आपने तेलंगाना का एक्सपीरियंस बताया बिकॉज ऑफ आधार लिंकिंग, क्या उनमें से किसी ने कोई लीगल एक्शन लिया, कोई कहीं कोई कंप्लेंट करी, कोर्ट में कहीं कोई केस फाइल किया? एक तो ये, और दूसरा कि क्या कोई भी मैकेनिज्म या पॉसिबिलिटी है, अगर किसी के साथ ऐसा हो तो वो कौन सी अथॉरिटी को अप्रोच कर सकते हैं, क्या कर सकते हैं, क्या रेमेडी अवेलेबल है? इसके बारे में अगर आप थोड़ा शेयर कर सके तो।
जी, डिलीशन ऑफ नेम्स के इशू में 2-3 केसेस पहले फाइल हुए थे, रिसेंटली नहीं, आधार के इशू में नहीं, उससे पहले PIL फाइल हुए थे। उसका स्टेटस चेक करना पड़ेगा, उसको स्टडी करना पड़ेगा, क्योंकि पॉलिटिकल पार्टीज ने उसको फाइल किए थे, तो आई डोंट थिंक कोर्ट उसको कितना सीरियस लेगा, और उसको किस तरीके से हमको आर्ग्यू करना पड़ेगा, क्योंकि आज की हालात अलग है। आज आधार को इन्होंने बेस बनाया है, पहले रैंडमली डिलीट करते थे, और कई बार रैंडमली डिलीट करने में हाई कोर्ट के ऑर्डर्स का भी हाथ रहा है। हाई कोर्ट ने कहा है कि ठीक है, आपके पास 1 लाख होने चाहिए, लेकिन 1,20,000 है, तो आप इमीडिएट इसको रेक्टिफाई करिए। तो कमीशन ने उसको रैंडमली डिलीट किया और रिपोर्ट सबमिट कर दी कि हमने कर दिया है सब। तो इस तरीके के है, लेकिन कॉम्प्रहेंसिव कोई केस अभी तक गया नहीं है, नंबर 1। नंबर 2, जो आपका था कि जो प्रोसेस हैं, जो म्युनिसिपल एक्ट जो है, जो GHMC को मॉनिटर करता है, उसमें क्लियरली लिखा हुआ है कि अगर आप किसी वोटर्स का नाम डिलीट करेंगे तो आपको नोटिस देनी पड़ेगी, आपको रीजन के साथ बतानी पड़ेगी। और इस एस्पेक्ट को लेते हुए जो हमारे एक सोशल एक्टिविस्ट है हैदराबाद के, लुबना सरवर, जो पॉलिटिकल पार्टी से भी जुड़े हुए हैं, लोग आम आदमी के साथ कंटेस्ट किए थे हैदराबाद पार्लियामेंट्री कॉन्स्टिट्यूंसी से, उन्होंने एक केस फाइल किया था यही बोलते हुए कि जो प्रोसेस था उसको आप लोगों ने अडॉप्ट नहीं किया। आई डोंट नो व्हाट इज द स्टेटस ऑफ दैट केस, लेकिन आई कैन चेक एंड लेट यू नो। कोई भी प्रोसेसेस में, जैसे राशन कार्ड का केस में बताया था, उसमें मेन ग्राउंड हमारा ये था कि आपने कंप्यूटर जनरेटेड प्रोग्राम पे एक्शन लिया है, आपने राशन कार्ड डिलीट किया है, लेकिन आपने बेनिफिशियरी को नोटिस नहीं दिया या आपने वेरीफाई नहीं किया फील्ड में जाके कि आप जो रिजल्ट हमको मिला है वो सही है या गलत है, ताकि जो अपॉर्चुनिटी देनी चाहिए बेनिफिशियरीज को उसकी बात रखने की, वो मौका आपने नहीं दिया। तो दिस इज अगेंस्ट द नेचुरल प्रोसेस एंड दिस लीगल प्रोसेस। तो उसको हम चैलेंज किए थे, इसमें भी हमको देखना पड़ेगा कि कैसे हम करेंगे।
इसी के एक्सटेंशन में एक क्वेश्चन और था कि अभी जैसे उन्होंने आधार और वोटर आईडी लिंकिंग का जो बिल पास हुआ है, उसमें ये भी लिखा है कि ना सिर्फ कि अगर कोई पहली बारी जब अपना नाम वोटर रोल में डलवाने के लिए आएगा तब भी आधार मांगा जा सकता है और वेरीफाई करने के लिए भी मांगा जा सकता है। तो जो पहली बारी अपना नाम लिखवाने की जाते हैं वोटर रोल में, अगर वहां पे मना कर दिया जाए कि आपका नाम जो भी है वेरीफाई नहीं हो रहा है, आधार से मैच नहीं कर रहा है, या किसी भी वजह से अगर उनका, या पहले भी अगर किसी का नाम वोटर रोल पे नहीं डाला जाता था किसी भी वजह से, तो क्या रिमेडी अवेलेबल होती है?
इलेक्ट्रल रजिस्ट्रेशन ऑफिसर जो रिस्पॉन्सिबल होता है इसको इनरोल करने के लिए, जो ऑथोराइज पर्सन है, ब्लॉक लेवल ऑफिसर कैन फिल अप द एप्लीकेशन और रिकमेंड कर सकता है कि ईआरओ को आप इसको प्रोसेस करिए। तो ईआरओ की रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी है कि वो चेक करें सारे डॉक्यूमेंट्स, लेकिन कई केसेस मुझे याद है जब एप्लीकेशन हम लोग 6-1 एप्लीकेशन होता है जो इनरोलमेंट के लिए देना होता है, वो देते थे, तो उसमें इनसफिशिएंट डॉक्यूमेंट्स या प्रूफ के ग्राउंड पे वो रिजेक्ट करते थे एप्लीकेशन। ऑनलाइन प्रोसेस जब था तब भी करते थे। ऑनलाइन प्रोसेस पहले बहुत ही इजी था, जिसमें हम किसी फैमिली मेंबर का, अपने जो रिलेटिव्स हैं उनकी एक डिटेल्स डाल दें और अपनी डिटेल्स डाल दें तो वो वेरीफाई हो जाता था। यानी कि मैं मेरी मदर का आईडी कार्ड का जो रेफरेंस है वो दे दूं तो होता था, लेकिन अभी नहीं कर रहे हैं वो लोग। ऑनलाइन पोर्टल में भी वो लोग बोल रहे हैं कि आप अपलोड करिए अपना एड्रेस प्रूफ, अपना आइडेंटिटी प्रूफ। आइडेंटिटी प्रूफ में अभी तो अब शायद वो लोग आधार कार्ड को ट्रीट करेंगे, पहले राशन कार्ड हुआ करता था, तो राशन कार्ड भी नहीं है। तो ईआरओ के पास ये पावर्स हैं जो रिजेक्ट करता है, एक्सेप्ट करता है एप्लीकेशन। अगर वो नहीं करता है तो वी कैन फाइल ए कंप्लेंट बिफोर द डिस्ट्रिक्ट इलेक्शन ऑफिसर, जो म्युनिसिपल कमिश्नर होता है।
Thank you so much, Mr. Misuse. I actually also had a question. Anecdotally, when do people who have been deleted from the electoral rolls, when do they actually realize that this has happened to them? Because as you said, there's no process of notifying them. So when do they actually kind of get to know that they've fallen off the list for rations or the voter list?
When they went to the polling booth और they accessing their right to vote, तो जब पता चला कि your name is not here, बस उनके पास वोटर आईडी कार्ड है, they have the voter ID card, but the original list they don't have their information and details.
Right. Thank you so much for this very illuminating talk. So we'll now move on to the next speaker.
Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry, thanks. So we'll just move on to the next speaker, Seema Chishti. She has actually sent a recording as she can't be here. Seema has been a multimedia journalist since 1990, working in print, radio, and television in English and in Hindi. She is currently teaching a course at the Asian College of Journalism in Chennai. So Seema's talk is about surveillance democracy. So surveillance and the adoption of intrusive technology by the state must matter much more to common citizens than it does. In the matter of Pegasus, there is perhaps no other country where such a wide cast of characters and people central to keeping democracy alive are alleged to have been surveilled. There is now a court-nominated committee to look into the allegations. But there should be much more attention and alarm over the state using cyber weapons on its people. Seema's talk will elaborate on how and why this has the potential to upend democracy and lays the framework for a bigger surrender as citizens to a much more powerful tech-powered state in the near future. So this is a pre-recorded talk, and I'm afraid that Seema will not be here to take questions. Thank you.
So the state's adoption of intrusive technology and threats to democracy, it's a really daunting kind of a mouthful. It's a long sentence. And what's scary is that how true each and every bit of it is. Among the saddest stories of last year, there have been plenty of bad stories that came our way in 2021. But one really sad story has been the sharp decline in democratic values in India. And as kind of actually calculated by people on the outside watching in, you have Freedom House, which declared India as partly free. We had VDEM, the respected Swedish institute, which called India an electoral autocracy now. So they even did away with the word democracy. International IDEA, of which India is a founding member, ranked India's freedoms currently at the same level at which they were in 1975, which is when a formal emergency was in place. But amidst all this bad news, one kind of creeping news, which really did not make it as much as it should have, was the fact that there was another index which said very clearly that India, the world's largest democracy, is also among the biggest surveillance states. The country ranks behind only Russia and China when it comes to surveilling its citizens. And this was something that you don't normally kind of expect, because a lot of us kind of go by the open, raucous, vibrant democracy phrases that are used so insistently, casually, and warmly. But it actually conceals a great kind of a surveillance that's going on now, which it's really important to get a grip on. So my hypothesis is really to look at this whole creeping up surveillance, particularly through various kinds of technologies and laws that India is using, in three different categories. So I wish to kind of talk about first what I term as big fish surveillance, number two, the small fish surveillance, and number three, the real dark mode. So it just kind of, I think, teases out the big S word of surveillance. And I hope to be able to make some sense of this in my session today. As far as big fish surveillance goes, you have to just look as far as the results of a global wide investigation, the Pegasus project, that spoke of the use, the pervasive, invasive use of Pegasus, an Israeli cyber weapon. It's a weapon. It's a cyber weapon, spyware, which is sold only to governments, and India figures high in the list of its application, according to this international investigation. We must always remember that the Indian government has never denied using Pegasus. There are no investigations it has ever put in place ever since this issue came to light in 2019. So effectively, they've never said, no, we're not using Pegasus, or it's wrong to use Pegasus. So the first of my three issues, the big fish surveillance and its impact on democracy, has to do with how Pegasus has been used. There's a wide cast of characters over whom this cyber weapon has been deployed. It consists of election commissioners, a Supreme Court judge, top heads of political parties, an election strategist, enforcement directorate officials, CBI heads, journalists, NGOs, doctors, epidemiologists, lawyers, you name it, a whole cast of characters. The first thing where surveillance, I think, damages democracy, and we need to pay attention to this, is political players. It transpired that through Pegasus, political players, the foremost opponent of the BJP, the Congress Party's former president, MP Rahul Gandhi, 2 of his phones, and phones of 5 others in his social circle who are not in public life, who are on the snoop list. A leading election opposition strategist, Prashant Kishore, was there. In Karnataka, phones used by senior members of the Janata Dal S and the Congress government and their aides were likely hacked by a head of the BJP ending up toppling the government. In Assam, 2 important political figures opposed to the controversial Citizenship Amendment Act had their numbers on the list for possible use. So what does that do when important political players or participants in democracy are being ostensibly surveilled and their phones have been hacked by this weapons grade spyware? Well, it destroys the level playing field, which is the basis of democracy. It gives the ruling party a symmetric amount of information and direct intelligence on its political rivals. So there is no sense of equality between people who are going to polls, which destroys a basic premise of liberal democracy. Let's look at the second cast of characters Pegasus decided to be deployed on. And these are independent institutions. What is a democracy but for independent, autonomous institutions, which kind of are the bulwarks of it all, which make the system work? We had the story of an election commissioner who at that time was on course to be the next chief of the Election Commission of India, and we found that he was on the Pegasus snoop list. He was the only one of the 3 in the commission at the time in 2019 who found certain statements by the Prime Minister during the 2019 general election campaign as violative of the Model Code of Conduct. He was under Pegasus. The journalist who reported on the commissioner's objections and made this information public was on the snoop list, as was a member of civil society, a prominent election watchdog who is known to not take things lying down. So these 3 kind of characters who intimately had to do with the business of running autonomous elections were on the Pegasus list. But wait. We found that one Supreme Court judge's, a sitting Supreme Court judge's number was on that list. A former Chief Justice of India was plagued by charges of sexual harassment, and the Supreme Court staffer who leveled those objections, people connected to her, 11 numbers of people connected to her were on the surveillance list. And lo and behold, by a very, very deep coincidence, after this sexual harassment case was put away under somewhat strange circumstances, the Chief Justice went on to give decisions that seemed to be all pro-executive. It just happens that they were. It was the Ayodhya judgment, the fate of election laws relating to electoral bonds, the Rafale fighter jet deal, and Kashmir's habeas corpus cases. And then after 4 months, this Chief Justice of India becomes a nominated Rajya Sabha MP. There were others on this list, which consisted of top honchos of the CBI. There was a war in the CBI going on at that time, a kind of an interagency war which had political connotations. An enforcement directorate official who was looking at very sensitive cases, a whole list of police officers who were manning controversial and political cases were on this Pegasus list. What does that do? What that does, if the first of going after political players hacks into the level playing field, this of course does that, but it also provides government with massive amount of private information, a lot of private personal information about these people that exists, which they can use to blackmail, bully, and target those who are heading the independent institutions. I mean, just as an example, one of the people being surveilled, a fairly independent-minded, supposedly at that time, an enforcement directorate official, has just taken VRS. In fact, his whole family was under surveillance, but he's just taken VRS and he's said to be contemplating contesting on a BJP ticket in the forthcoming UP polls. An enforcement directorate official handling some of the most high-fi cases, most high-profile cases. The third is of independent journalists, academics, NGOs, and other civil society agents under surveillance. This is not very simple at all, because what is a democracy but for NGOs, independent people who are not possibly parts of formal structures or pillars of democracy, but they are part of very important voices and conveyor belts. They are people who convey information from bottom up, who keep vital feedback loops in a democracy alive. And once they are under surveillance, if Gagandeep Kang is under surveillance, if independent journalists, editors of independent portals, other journalists making important points and who are dissenters, who do not necessarily just take a pro-government line, if they are under surveillance, what do? You push the chilling effect of creeps in. And number two, again, information gathered about their personal lives, about their private lives, can be used in ways in which they can be, they can be compromised, they can be bullied and blackmailed. I'll just give you one example about a Moroccan historian called Mati Munjib. He was targeted using Pegasus. This has also been unveiled by the same international consortium, which called Project Pegasus. What agencies in Morocco did was gathered enough evidence about his private life over a year. And then armed intelligence agents raided his home at 9 a.m. one morning and found him and a female friend in the bedroom together. They stripped him naked, arrested him for adultery, which is a crime in Morocco, and he spent 10 months in a Casablanca prison. So what you do is you're able to render private personal information and in such a way use it to completely render important, vital players of democracy voiceless. So in this sort of big fish surveillance that this government has never denied be undertaking on all these people renders the level playing field inactive. What it does is compromise or have the capacity to compromise independent institutions which are really the nuts and bolts of a functioning democracy. They render them inoperational. And number three, absolutely, shall we say, throttles independent voices and gets people who are important civil society participants, activists, doctors, etc., silences them either by scaring them as you know that they're being surveilled, or finds out so much about them that you're able to choke their voices and fundamentally compromise democracy. That's your big fish surveillance for you. A second thing which this government has been doing has been the small fish surveillance. I call this small fish because it's not as if the people they're surveilling are small, but people generally, what have I done, which is, why should I've gone for a movie, I've had a pizza, these are my habits, it's my sexual orientation, this is who I vote for. How does it matter if it gets anonymized and used? Well, we know what surveillance big tech has been up to. It surveils and snoops on ordinary citizens. It gathers all kinds of data on its users, their views, location, political and sexual orientation, their weaknesses, strengths. Massive data is at their command. So while I think I have nothing to hide, taken together, the summation of all this information from anonymous people, from just the ordinary, voter, citizen of India, that big tech gathers, it has huge potential to allow them to put out personalized political ads, to essentially divide the electorate, to divide them and therefore subvert democracy, because you polarize people by you destroy the basics of democracy. There's a lot that has been written on this, and it's clearly and well-established fact that big tech is able to do that. But where does the Indian government come into all this? Well, what the Indian government has done is contrary to what governments in Europe are doing, even in the USA, what governments are doing. There's no clear relationship of accountability that is being demanded of big tech. There is a very neat carrot and stick, sort of passive-aggressive relationship with big tech. So you kind of have the IT rules where you are mounting this, that there is all this pressure on big tech to conform. But what you also do is make clear that you'll be okay if, maybe data is shared with them. These are unknown backroom deals that governments may be having with big tech because of this policy. And I say this not because I charge a big conspiracy of the central government being in cahoots with big tech, but, the Wall Street Journal, N number of reports have come in which speak of how particularly Facebook, the behemoth among big tech, has been quite kind on the BJP and on the ruling party and has allowed a lot of their posts, even if they violate a lot of things that Facebook follows online, which it says it follows in other countries and certainly in the USA, but they've allowed them to be on. So they've been kinder to the BJP, even by the looks of it, by open available data would suggest that. And we have no idea about what the backroom deal is at the back of all this. Is it to allow big tech to make money while they are kind of just dealt with in this, with the help of IT rules? And so the government is able to combine all the data that it gets from big tech along with new rules it has now put in place, which is of linking Aadhaar with your voter ID, and a personal data protection bill, which only protects governments and not the average citizen. It just allows government to be immune from all regulation on how personal data is collected. So by gathering masses of bytes of data of these small fish, it is able to actually make sense of the electorate in the way it wants to, and slice and dice it, and potentially be a threat to democracy in ways that we cannot even imagine now. If it has the entire data set from big tech and from its own recently really prohibitive and narrowing rules, such as tying up election Aadhaar with the voter ID, then you have a case of surveillance which completely just, it's almost as if the hatch is just closing in on you. So though small people think that their data doesn't matter, but all of this put together gives people who are collecting this, surveilling this, an enormous amount of control and a hold on who they are governing. And there is no question of a level playing field. It distorts democracy beyond comprehension. The third, what I'd like to believe, the third way in which government is going around using surveillance to damage is probably the most sort of, is probably the scariest. And it's half proven, but you just have to look at whatever is available in public domain and how it's being handled to get very scared and very worried about it. This is what I call the dark mode way, the third way in which surveillance is being used to kind of distort democracy. The Bhima Koregaon case, the BKC case, the BK16 as they were called, and then the BK15 after the 87-year-old Jesuit priest died. There are BK15. This is almost like the canary in the coal mine of India's democracy. And we should really care about how that canary is doing. The canary in the coal mine is often the canary in the coal mine, which if it starts feeling ill, earlier people would go and pump in more oxygen to improve the quality of oxygen in the shaft. That was the idea, that you use the canary in the coal mine to tell you about the health and the wholesomeness of the mine. And we should really worry about BKC, about lawyers, academics, priests, dissenters, authors being in jail for more than 2 years, 2 years in a lot of cases, without the trial even starting. But so this is just another case, but what do several of them and their lawyers have in common? Well, they were surveilled via Pegasus before their arrests. At that time, when their names came forward, when some of their lawyers' names came forward, they were just, ordinary lawyers in small towns. But it so transpires now that Pegasus was on their phones before they were arrested. And the darker side, which is what really makes this kind of surveillance dark mode, is what the Washington Post reported in February this year. The 10 letters had been deposited on the laptop by clearly a powerful hacker on the laptop of Rona Wilson, a Delhi-based rights activist. And then another 22 sets of documents were loaded on his laptop. It was established by Arsenal, a digital forensics firm, which is based in Massachusetts, USA, a respectable firm. It has actually looked at 2 reports, and it has concluded that files were planted on the laptop of Rona Wilson, and it is on the basis of those very files planted, it would appear, that Rona Wilson is serving a jail sentence, and under the most stringent laws of India. So we don't really know, because the matter is still to be heard in the Mumbai High Court, and there have been 2 appeals. I think there's not been a substantive hearing of the matter. But to think that it's not just surveillance, but some very powerful hacker has been able to deposit 32 files on the laptop of Rona Wilson. And there he is behind bars, and for a long time, and under the most stringent kind of laws. So other than losing this time, we've lost Rona Wilson, we've lost 14 of these people as being symbols of people who comment on democracy, who take positions on democracy, who are articulate, who can see things, who are not known to be supporters of government, being put out of action. So that's one way in which surveillance can go in and directly attack democratic rights of people, their rights, but beyond BK15. This speaks for all of us, for 1.4 billion, for whose rights these people have stood for. So I think the kind of scenario that in India we worry about now, about surveillance, and how state surveillance through use of intrusive technology, its kind of marriage with laws and its own data collection, its treatment of big tech, poses a severe challenge to India. So while you have the sort of Turkish business, what Turkey does with its internet, we have Russia doing its own little, it has its own little room in how it functions. We have China, the Chinese firewall is discussed. But I think India's very sophisticated and very dark surveillance scenario should leave us all worried, because it's all happening in the name of democracy, in the happening of laws that are clearing parliament. And it damages democracy in ways that we can no longer say that, how does it matter? As apparently the Google founder, Eric Schmidt, once sort of almost mocking at people who worry about privacy, said that if you don't want people to find out, then you need not be, you shouldn't be doing something, or words to that effect. Well, as somebody said, that most people who say things like, it doesn't matter, what I do is all in the open, why should I care? But then the same people get very worried when I ask them to take all their clothes off. So I think to not recognize what is private, what is personal, would be to ignore one of the biggest perils on India's democracy. It's a long shadow, and we need to really be vigilant. And the first step towards being vigilant about it and being able to roll it back is to really understand how it's not just someone else's phone that's being hacked. It's not just Facebook, some random information that's going out. All of this added together, the surveillance on big fish, surveillance on small fish, and dark mode surveillance ought to concern us a lot.
So I can't think of a better kind of end to today's conference. As Seema's talk kind of pretty much kind of sums up many of the themes of what we've been talking about today. It's very clear from the conversations that have been happening today that data gathering has, far exceeded its extended and its stated scope, which obviously does make it easier for governments to triangulate data on individuals, putting citizen privacy at stake. And of course, we also have the lack of legislation or regulation that allows many of these things, or also, as Usha mentioned, just ignoring of these legislations or regulations. I think something that the One Vote kind of initiative is really dedicated to is informing citizens in order to kind of shape their understanding of the narrative. Because as we've also taken away from some of the talks, the narrative control is kind of held in the hands of the incumbent. And of course, these are complex scenarios, which it isn't possible for everyone to kind of be abreast of and be aware of. And so I think, of course, while transparency would be welcome, I think one of the most important implications is that we also kind of as organizations and as citizens ensure that other citizens are informed about what is happening in the name of democracy. And ensure that there is wider awareness of all of these complex undertakings by the government that might be threatening the very nature of the democracy that we live in. So in case you would like to continue this conversation, it is possible for you to leave questions on the submissions of our speakers today. So we will share a link with you where you can, it's available on the HasGeek website, where you can share your thoughts or comments or questions for the speakers. And they will respond to it when they are informed that those questions have been shared. Also, videos will be available in a week. After the conference, you'll be notified by email in case you're subscribed to HasGeek, or by SMS if your preferences have been updated. And I'll just share the link to the HasGeek site for the questions right here. And I'll hand it over to Maansi. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Padmini, I think I'll start by first thanking you for being for conducting the entire conference very wonderfully, very seamlessly, and for keeping us all engaged throughout the conference. I would also like to thank all the speakers who took out the time to come and attend the conference today to share their thoughts with us and to engage with the audience and answer all the questions. I'd also like to thank everyone at HasGeek and OneVote project for making the conference possible today. And I mean, this is one of the things that we are going to be doing as part of the OneVote project, and hopefully there will be many more activities on which we'll be working together to keep the conversation going in the future as well. And finally, I'd like to thank our media partners, the Quint, who allowed us to use their YouTube channel to live stream the conversation, helping us reach a wide number of people, and also the Bastion, who we'll be working with in the future as well, to come out with interesting stories and publications on these issues. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone who joined the conference today. I hope that you will keep engaging with us with Article 21, with the OneVote project, with Rethink Aadhaar, and with HasGeek on all these issues with respect to use of technology that we have been working on. So please feel free to reach out to any of us. We are available on the different social media channels as well as on the HasGeek platform. You can find our profiles. So with that, I would now close the conference. Thank you so much, everyone.